There are moments in history that never truly end, only hidden beneath the dust, waiting for silence to return. In the heart of the ancient Mesopotamian plain, where the Tigris and Euphrates once gleamed under a softer sun, stood temples older than memory. Here, the first priests spoke not to kings, but to the stars. They tended sacred fires, measured the rhythm of the skies, and whispered the names of gods that once breathed the order of creation itself. Tonight, you'll drift through their world, a realm of incense, ritual, and divine law, and listen to the voices of the first keepers of knowledge. The Forgotten Priesthood of Ancient Mesopotamia. Chapter 1. The Land Between Rivers. Before there were empires, there was silence. And in that silence, two rivers began to speak, between the Tigris and the Euphrates. A landscape unfolded that would one day give birth to everything we now call civilization, law, language, ritual, and belief. Yet before the walls of cities, before the rise of kings, there was only the steady rhythm of water moving through clay and reeds. The land was unpredictable, sometimes generous, sometimes harsh. Floods arrived without warning, turning the fertile plains into oceans of silt. But when the waters receded, they left behind the richest soil known to the ancient world. Out of this delicate cycle of destruction and renewal, early communities began to see the reflection of something divine. It was not the gods who created Mesopotamia, they believed, but Mesopotamia that revealed the gods. The earliest settlers, the Sumerians, came here around 6,000 years ago, drawn by the river's promise of life. They built villages of mud brick and began to understand the sky. They watched the stars rise over the horizon and the sun return faithfully each day. In this constant pattern of nature, they felt an unseen order, a sacred rhythm holding chaos at bay. They named a land Eden, meaning plain. Later, the same word would echo through myth as Eden. To live between the rivers was to live at the center of the world, where heaven's flow met the earth's breath. The people of this land believed that every harvest, every rainfall, every spark of life was part of a divine conversation. Humans were not separate from the cosmos. They were participants in its ritual. Over generations, small villages became towns, and towns grew into city-states. Your Uruk, Eridu, Nipper. Each city had its own god, its own temple, its own sacred responsibilities. Yet all shared the same belief that human life existed to maintain balance between heaven and earth. The priests, known as the Sangha or En, emerged as mediators of that balance. They learned the patterns of the stars, the cycles of the rivers, and the language of the gods themselves. The temple, the ziggurat, was their instrument. To the modern eye, it was a massive step pyramid rising from the plain. But to those who built it, it was a mountain of meaning, a bridge between the mortal and the eternal. Each level represented a layer of existence, the underworld, the earth, and the heavens above. At its summit, offerings of food, incense, and prayer were given not as tribute, but as sustenance, for even gods, they believed, required nourishment from the devotion of humankind. The temple was also an archive. Within its courtyards, the first scribes pressed reeds into wet clay, marking symbols that would become the cuneiform script. These early tablets recorded not only grain tallies or trade, but hymns, invocations, and the rhythms of sacred duty. Religion was not separate from life. It was the framework that held life together. To plant seeds was to perform ritual. To irrigate the fields was to imitate the rivers of creation. Each morning, the priests rose before the sun. They bathed in river water, symbolically cleansing the spirit from the dust of sleep. They donned simple linen garments and stepped barefoot into the temple courtyard. The air would still carry the scent of yesterday's fires. They began their day by greeting the east, the direction of life, and reciting hymns, in a cadence that mirrored the flowing of the Tigris. They believed that words, spoken with precision and reverence, carried power. Language itself was divine, a gift from Enki, the god of wisdom and water. Through words, creation was ordered. Through words, chaos could be tamed. And so the priesthood speech became an act of preservation, a daily renewal of cosmic harmony. To understand this belief is to see how religion and survival were inseparable. The rivers gave life, but they could also take it away. A single failed flood could mean famine. A storm too strong could erase an entire harvest. The people looked to their priests, not just for spiritual comfort, but for knowledge. These early priesthoods were astronomers, architects, physicians, and mathematicians. They studied the seasons to predict floods, calculated the movement of stars to time their rituals, and read the patterns of animal entrails to glimpse the will of unseen forces. But beneath all this knowledge lay a quiet truth. Humanity's first spirituality was born from awe. To live between the rivers was to stand at the edge of mystery, to witness how death and life were woven into one. The Mesopotamians did not seek to conquer the divine. They sought to align with it, to live within its rhythm. As reeds bend in the wind yet never break, their myths reflected this harmony. They told of Enlil, the god of wind and authority, who separated heaven from earth so that form could arise from chaos. Of Inanna, who governed both love and war, teaching that creation and destruction were twins. Of Enki, who shaped humankind from clay and filled them with the breath of consciousness. The stories were not mere tales, they were mirrors, reflecting the truth that the divine was both within and beyond them. Archaeologists have uncovered thousands of tablets describing temple rituals, offerings, and prayers. Through them, we learned that the priesthood saw itself not as master, but as servant. Their role was not to control the gods, but to maintain the delicate connection between the visible and the invisible. Every action, lighting a lamp, pouring oil, reciting a hymn, was done with careful precision. For each gesture echoed through eternity. To modernize, their world may seem distant. Yet, if you close yours for a moment, you might imagine it, the hum of insects in the heat, the soft rush of the Euphrates in the distance, the murmur of priests chanting to the dawn. Their temples, though long reduced to ruins, once shimmered with color, blues for the heavens, golds for the sun, and deep reds for the fertile earth. The scent of burning cedar filled the air, and above it all, the sky, vast, patient, eternal, reflected in the waters below. In the rhythm of those two rivers, the people found meaning. They believed that every current was a whisper of divine intention, that to live rightly was to move in harmony with those unseen tides. And so the priesthood was not merely religious. It was ecological, cosmic, and moral. They understood that the survival of civilization depended on respect for the waters, the soil, and the divine intelligence flowing through them all. When droughts came, the people fasted. When floods destroyed villages, they rebuilt with patience, believing the gods were teaching humility. And when the harvests returned, they gave thanks, not with noise, but with stillness, a silence that acknowledged both gratitude and awe. The land between rivers became a living scripture. Every sunrise, every flood, Every breath of wind wrote another verse in humanity's unfolding understanding of the sacred dot. And from this soil, from these waters, the first priestly voices rose. They carried with them not the sound of dominance, but of devotion. A quiet vow to keep the world in balance. The same vow, perhaps, that still stirs somewhere within us. A memory of when humanity first learned to listen to the language of the earth. Chapter 2. The Ziggurat and the Sky. At the Mesopotamian plain, where the rivers Tigris and Euphrates carried the lifeblood of the world's first cities, a strange kind of mountain began to rise. It was not formed by wind or rain, but by human devotion. Brick by brick, tear upon tear, the people built upward toward the gods they could not see, yet felt in every breath of wind, every flood, every star that shimmered above the desert night. They called it a ziggurat, to build high, but its purpose was never only to reach the sky. It was a meeting place between heaven and earth. In the cities of your Uruk and Babylon, the ziggurat dominated the horizon. It stood at the center of daily life, the architectural heart of civilization, and the spiritual spine of an entire worldview. Each level symbolized a different realm of existence, stacked like the layers of creation itself. The lowest platform represented the earth, where humans walked. The middle tiers symbolized the heavens of the planets and the constellations, and the highest sanctuary, the shrine at the summit, was where the divine could descend. Inside, the air was heavy with incense and the quiet murmur of priests tracing stars onto clay tablets. The ziggurat was not a place for public worship. Ordinary citizens rarely entered. It was a sacred observatory, a cosmic temple, a clock made of stone. The priests of Sumer were more than caretakers of ritual. They were mathematicians, astronomers, and philosophers. From the top of the ziggurat, they watched the night sky, charting the slow rhythm of planets as if listening to a divine heartbeat. Each movement of Venus, Mars, or Jupiter was recorded not as cold data, but as living prophecy. To them, the heavens were not separate from the human story. They believed the divine order, me, flowed through both the stars and the cities. When a star appeared in the east, it foretold the fate of kings. When another dimmed, it spoke of floods or of plenty. Time itself was written above them, and they read it like scripture. Archaeologists who later uncovered the ruins of these stepped towers found baked bricks still stamped with the names of rulers, each name a prayer, each inscription a testament to human longing. The bricks themselves were offerings, thousands of them, carrying the marks of hands that believed each touch might bridge the gap between clay and eternity. At night, the summit chamber, called the Bitakich, or House of the New Year, was said to host the presence of the gods. From there, divine will was believed to descend into the world below. In return, priests sent upward the songs and rituals of the earth, a cycle of descent and ascent, not unlike the motion of the stars they studied. One of the most famous of these towers was the ziggurat of Ur, built over 4,000 years ago for the moon god Inanna. Its massive stairways faced the cardinal directions, each aligned with the movement of heavenly bodies. As the moon waxed and waned, priests ascended its steps, carrying offerings and chants timed to the rhythm of lunar cycles. From afar, the ziggurat must have appeared like a stairway suspended in the sky, each level shimmering under the moonlight, as if echoing the silver glow of the god it honored. This symmetry between earth and sky was intentional. It was theology expressed through geometry. In the Mesopotamian mind, To build high was to restore balance. To ascend was not an act of defiance, but of alignment. The ziggurat was humanity's promise to remain in dialogue with the heavens, to remember that everything above had its reflection below. The great tower of Babylon, later called the Enki house of the foundation of heaven and earth, carried this symbolism even further. Its 7 levels mirrored the 7 planetary gods. Its peak was believed to touch the threshold of the divine. The city around it thrived not only in trade and politics, but as a sacred mirror of the cosmos. The biblical Tower of Babel may have drawn from this memory. Yet, to the ancient Mesopotamians, it was never about human arrogance. It was about connection, a yearning to understand the laws that governed both stars and souls. Within the inner chambers of these temples, ritual and observation intertwined. Priests rose before dawn to greet the first light, offering libations of water and grain. They studied the sky at dusk, marking the precise moment when one planet overtook another. Every ceremony was timed to celestial motion. Every act of worship was synchronized with the cosmic rhythm. Through these observances, they believed harmony was maintained between divine order and human life. When that rhythm was broken by drought, by invasion, by neglect, the gods were said to withdraw their favor. And so, rebuilding the ziggurat became more than architecture. It was a spiritual restoration, a recalibration of the universe itself. Modern excavations reveal how deeply this belief shaped the very design of the cities. From the placement of temples to the orientation of streets, everything followed celestial logic. Babylon, for instance, was laid out as a cosmic map, its center aligned to the North Star, its canals echoing the flow of the heavens. Even the timing of royal ceremonies matched solstices and equinoxes. What we see in these ancient blueprints is not primitive superstition, but an early form of cosmic science. A worldview that refused to separate the sacred from the measurable, where the path of a planet and the path of a prayer were 2 languages telling the same truth. There is something profoundly human about this. Instinct to build upward, the desire to climb, to reach, to see from a higher place, both physically and spiritually. Standing on the top of the ziggurat, the priests must have felt the desert wind like the breath of the gods, the stars close enough to touch. In those moments, they were mediators between worlds, not rulers of the sky, but listeners of its song. Perhaps that is what the ziggurat ultimately represents, a bridge of listening, an ancient attempt to harmonize human life with something infinite. Even now, as we study their ruins, we can still feel that quiet aspiration, the longing, to understand our place in the great turning of the cosmos. And maybe that's what all great temples are, not monuments of certainty, but questions built in stone. Each stairway a thought, each level an echo of wonder. The ziggurat, rising toward the stars, was never just a ladder for the gods to descend. It was a reminder that humanity, too, was meant to ascend. Not in power, but in understanding. And as the stars turned above those ancient towers, time itself whispered the same mystery. The divine does not live beyond the sky. It lives in the meeting point between the earth we build upon and the heavens we reach toward. Chapter 3. Enlil and the Breath of Authority. In the heart of ancient Sumer, where the winds met the plains, there stood the holy city of Nippur. It was not the largest, nor the richest, but it was the spiritual axis of Mesopotamia, the city of Enlil, the god of air, law, and command. To the Sumerians, Enlil was not simply a deity among many. He was the breath that animated the world, the invisible force that moved clouds, carried storms, and stirred the dust beneath human feet. The people said that Enlil's temple, the Eka, the mountain house, touched the boundary between earth and heaven. From its high terrace, priests watched the horizon for signs of his moods. A sudden gust of wind, a shifting of clouds, a quiet rustle across the reeds, all could be read as the movement of Enlil's will. He was unseen, but never absent. His presence was felt in every season, in every change of weather, in every breath of air. And from this unseen power, the idea of authority itself was born. The myth of Enlil begins in a time when the world was still half divine, half human. According to Sumerian tradition, it was Enlil who separated heaven from earth, dividing in Ar, the sky god, from Ki, the earth goddess. Through this act, he made space for life to exist between them. The breath of Enlil was the first wind, the first motion. It was the dividing line between chaos and order. From that moment forward, Enlil became the custodian of cosmic structure. He was the arbiter of laws not written by men but by the universe itself. When kings later ruled in Sumer and Akkad, they claimed their power as a reflection of Enlil's breath, a divine right flowing through them. Just as air fills the lungs, every edict, every treaty, every ritual of kingship began with an invocation to him. Without Enlil's approval, a throne was only a chair, a ruler merely a man. Within the temple complex of Nippur, his priests lived lives of precision and devotion. They were called the servants of the wind, and they moved according to cycles of sacred timing. At dawn, they greeted the east wind with prayers. At dusk, they listened for the changing tone of the breeze, interpreting it as a message from their god. Every gust, every calm, every storm carried meaning. They believed that when Enlil exhaled, kings rose. When he turned away, empires fell. The rituals of these priests were deeply intertwined with justice and governance. They maintained the balance of the calendar, the legitimacy of rulers, and the purity of sacred oaths. In times of drought or flood, they would perform rites to calm Enlil's anger, to remind him that humankind still listened. Their understanding of authority was not political, but cosmic. Law was not a human invention. It was a reflection of divine order, breathed into being by the unseen force that shaped the sky. One of the oldest surviving texts, the Enlil hymn of Nippur, describes him as the roaring storm that establishes the foundations of kingship. He is both giver and taker of rule, gentle breeze and devastating wind. To the ancients, this duality mirrored the fragile balance of power in their own societies. A king was not an absolute ruler. He was a custodian of Enlil's breath. To misuse that authority, to become unjust, arrogant, or deaf to divine law, was to choke the sacred current that sustained the world. When rulers failed in their duty, storms were said to follow. Winds that once carried prosperity turned violent. Dust clouds swallowed the fields. It was not merely nature rebelling, but morality itself, reflected through the elements. The Eka temple stood as both sanctuary and observatory. From its terraces, priests observed the signs that would guide royal decisions. If winds came from the west, it was a warning of conflict. If they came from the east, it was a sign of renewal. They read omens not as superstition but as dialogue, a conversation between human action and divine response. They recorded these interpretations on clay tablets, building an archive of divine dreams. Over centuries, These tablets became the foundation for legal and administrative systems across Mesopotamia. Even the famed Code of Hammurabi echoed the same idea, that justice was not man-made, it was divine breath, given form in human words. When Hammurabi proclaimed that he had received his authority from the gods, it was Enlil's ancient logic he echoed, the belief that the moral order of heaven must be mirrored on earth. But Enlil's presence was not always kind. In the myth of the Great Flood, it was he who decided that humanity had become too noisy, too restless, disturbing the sleep of the gods. And so he summoned the waters to cleanse the world. Yet, in this act of destruction, another truth emerged. Even divine law could be tempered by mercy. The flood was not the end, but a correction, a resetting of balance. When the waters receded, Enlil granted humanity new boundaries, new order. It was as if the breath that once destroyed had become the wind that renewed to the Sumerians. This was not contradiction, it was balance. The same air that gives life can also take it away. Every law carries both justice and consequence. Inside Nipper's temple courts, rituals reflected this constant balance between reverence and restraint. Priests carried sacred vessels filled with water from the Euphrates, symbols of the flood that once erased mankind, and of the mercy that followed. They would pour it upon the ground, letting it mingle with dust, creating a thin layer of sacred mud, a reminder that life itself was born from the meeting of water and air. In these moments, the philosophy of Enlil was not abstract. It was tactile, immediate, human. The same breath that moved across the fields also filled their lungs. The same water that flooded their world also nourished their crops. The gods were not separate from life. They were life, experienced through its most elemental forms. Even today, the ruins of Nipper still whisper that story. Broken tablets lie scattered where scribes once recorded decrees of kings. The remains of the Eka still rise faintly from the desert, a ghost of a structure that once anchored heaven and earth. Wind still moves across it, carrying sand and silence. It is as if Enlil's breath has never truly ceased. Archaeologists who walk those grounds often describe a stillness that feels alive, a weight in the air, an echo of something greater. Perhaps it is only imagination, or perhaps it is memory carried on the same air that once filled those ancient lungs in the end. Enlil's greatest legacy was not his storms or his temple, but the idea he breathed into civilization, that authority to be just must remain invisible, like the wind. It cannot be held, only felt. It cannot be seen, only known through its effects. The laws of the land, the oaths of kings, the rise and fall of cities, all were bound to this principle. To act in harmony with divine order was to move with the wind. To resist it was to invite the storm. And perhaps that is the quiet wisdom the ancients wanted to preserve, that the breath of the divine is always moving, shaping, judging, renewing. It is the same air we breathe, the same rhythm that moves through our lives. Every law, every word of justice, every rise of power, all still carry a trace of Enlil's breath, a whisper of the unseen wind that first gave the world its order, and that continues to move, softly, through time. Chapter 4. The Sacred Rivers and the Cleansing Rites. Before the sun touched the horizon, before the city stirred with life, the priests of ancient Mesopotamia walked toward the water, their feet pressed into the soft, cool earth of the riverbank. They came silently, in single file, carrying no words, only intention. The ritual was as old as civilization itself. In the dim light of dawn, The Euphrates and Tigris shimmered with a muted gold, their gentle currents whispering against stone and red. The priests would kneel, submerging their hands, their faces, and then their entire body. They believed that this act was not a symbol, it was a sacred truth. The river was alive, infused with a divine breath that cleansed both flesh and spirit. To wash was to return, to align oneself once again with the order of the cosmos. For, in Mesopotamia, purification was not a moral gesture, but a cosmic necessity. To approach the temple without cleansing was to bring imbalance into the house of the gods. The people of this ancient land lived between two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. From them came life, and with them came danger. Floods destroyed homes, droughts broke harvests, and yet these waters were never cursed. They were honored as the veins of the divine. The rivers were more than geography. They were theology. Each drop was believed to carry the memory of creation, a flow that began when the gods first shaped the world out of chaos. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, all things were born from water. Apsu, the freshwater abyss, and Tiamat, the salt sea, mingled their essence, and from their meeting, the gods themselves arose to bathe in water, then was to step back into that moment of beginning, to be made new by the same substance that birthed the heavens. Before dawn each day, temple priests enacted what was called Tamku Elu, the sacred washing. It was performed not only before rituals but before speech, before any utterance of the divine names. The priests would enter the river or use basins filled with flowing water drawn under moonlight. They would wash the mouth, for the mouth was the gate through which prayers would soon travel. They washed the hands, for those hands would touch sacred offerings. And they washed the heart, not with water alone, but through quiet recitation of hymns to the goddess Nensh or the god Ea, patrons of purity and order. To the priest, water was not merely a tool, it was a covenant. It bound the human act of ritual to the divine act of creation. As the river cleansed, it also remembered, carrying away the old, making room for what was new. In Mesopotamian thought, impurity was not only physical or moral, it was energetic. Anything that disrupted harmony between the human and divine realms could bring misfortune, illness, crop failure, even the silence of oracles. When these imbalances arose, priests performed ceremonies of Numburbi, rites of purification meant to dissolve curses and restore equilibrium. Clay figures representing evil spirits or broken vows were washed in river water, then cast downstream. As they floated away, so too did the burden of sin. The ritual phrase whispered by the priests was simple: "Let the river carry it away." It was both a prayer and a law of nature, that everything unclean, whether seen or unseen, must flow toward dissolution. Nothing was destroyed. All was transformed. The temple complex often had a sacred pool called the Apsu, built to echo the cosmic waters beneath the earth. This pool was used for cleansing before entering the inner sanctum, where the god's statue resided. To stand before the divine without purification was unthinkable. It was said that the god would turn away, not in anger, but in withdrawal, for the impure could not resonate with the divine. Frequency of truth. The Apsu pool connected every ritual to the ancient myth of the god Ea or Enki, who ruled over the fresh waters below the earth. Ea was the master of cleansing, wisdom, and renewal. He was the purifier who washed away the chaos that crept back into the world with every passing season. His waters were the foundation of all sacred knowledge. Priests invoked his name before every cleansing rite, reciting, "By the pure waters of Ea, let my body and soul be restored." The act of purification also extended beyond the priesthood. Common people, before festivals or offerings, would bathe in the river or sprinkle themselves with water drawn at sunrise. Families cleansed their homes with water and salt, believed to absorb negativity. Women washed before childbirth. Men before harvest or travel. To live near water was to live near renewal. Even the dead were washed before burial, their bodies anointed with oils mixed with river clay. For death itself was seen as a journey, a crossing of another kind of river. The Mesopotamians believed that the soul, upon leaving the body, traveled down the waters of no return, into the underworld of Uruk. To wash the dead was to prepare them for that passage, ensuring their spirit entered the realm below in peace. Thus, from birth to death, water framed the cycle of being. It was the silent witness of human existence, always flowing, always forgiving. To the Mesopotamians, rivers were not metaphors. They were living presences. Each had its divine counterpart. The Tigris as the blade of Inanna, the god of strength and harvest, and the Euphrates as the beloved of Ishtar, goddess of fertility and renewal. When they flooded, it was seen as divine emotion, sometimes wrath, sometimes blessing. When they ran dry, it was a call for reflection and repentance. The rituals of cleansing were a way of listening, of entering dialogue with the divine world. Through these acts, the priest did not demand forgiveness. He simply aligned himself with what already was, the eternal current of divine mercy. The waters did not judge. They carried, they moved endlessly forward, transforming what they touched. To immerse oneself in them was to remember the truth that everything, no matter how could be made clean again through return and surrender. Archaeologists today uncover remnants of these practices in temple, ruins, stone basins, drainage channels, inscriptions etched beside wells. On clay tablets, prayers for purification have survived for over 4,000 years. One such hymn reads, "Waters of the deep, who cleanse the heart of man, wash me pure, that I may stand before the gods. Let my sins be scattered like reeds upon the current. Let my guilt be swallowed by the flowing earth." These lines are not just relics. They are echoes of a spiritual understanding that saw water as more than matter, as movement, memory, and mercy. Even now, when the Tigris glimmers under the morning sun, it carries that ancient truth. Somewhere beneath its surface flows the same current that once touched the hands of priests, kings, and poets. The same current that whispered of creation and cleansing, of the endless rhythm between chaos and order. Perhaps that is what made the Mesopotamian vision of purity so profound. It was not the belief that one could remain forever clean. It was the recognition that cleansing was a rhythm, a sacred return. That impurity, like drought or flood, was part of the cycle. And that through the act of washing, humans could participate again in the work of the gods, the work of renewal, as the priests rose from the water. Droplets shimmering across their robes, they did not see themselves as separate from the river. They were the river living vessels of the same current that sustained creation. With that realization came calm and courage and readiness. They would walk back toward the temple, the first light of dawn spilling across the stones. Their voices, now clean, would rise in hymns once more, offering breath to the wind and water to the divine dot. For in that quiet, shimmering hour, they understood. Purity was not absence of sin. It was alignment, the eternal rhythm between the mortal and the divine. And every river, still flowing after all these ages, continues to sing that truth, that in cleansing we do not erase who we are. We simply remember what we have always been. Chapter 5. Enki, Lord of the deep knowing beneath the sands of southern Mesopotamia. Before the great rivers had carved their kingdoms, there stood a city said to be the oldest of them, Alaridu, to the Sumerians. It was not built by men, but founded by the gods themselves. In its center rose a temple unlike any other, the Iabzu, the house of the deep waters. It was here that Enki, the god of wisdom and creation, was said to dwell, ruler of the Abzu, the subterranean ocean that fed both the physical and spiritual worlds. To understand Enki is to step quietly into a different kind of divinity, one not born of thunder or flame, but of insight and balance. He was not a god of conquest or punishment. He was a god of knowing. In the myths, Enki was one of the first gods to emerge from the primeval sea, the offspring of the sky, Father An, and the earth Mother Ki, while others ruled through decree or destruction. Enki governed through intelligence's realm, not the heavens, but the waters beneath them. The Abzu, for the Sumerians, was not merely an underground spring. It was the cosmic reservoir of all potential, the birthplace of life, knowledge, and invention. Every river and canal was seen as an artery of this deep wisdom, flowing upward into the human world. The people of Eridu believed that when they drew water for ritual or for irrigation, they were touching the very body of Enki. This concept that wisdom flows, like water runs, like a thread through Mesopotamian thought. The deeper one looked into the Abzu, the closer one came to the truth. Within the sacred precinct of the Iabzu, Enki's priests worked not as warriors or rulers, but as keepers of hidden systems. They were astronomers, healers, and builders. They recorded the rhythms of the stars, the progress of the moon, and the geometry of temples to them. Knowledge itself was a divine current, something that required discipline and reverence to channel properly. Every act of study was a prayer, every new insight a ripple in the water of the gods. Enki's wisdom was said to have shaped the foundations of civilization itself. In Sumerian hymns, he is credited with giving humanity language, craft, music, and the sacred art of measurement, ability to bring order from chaos. One text, the myth of Enki and the world order, describes how he distributed the divine principles that governed every aspect of existence: justice, craftsmanship, fertility, kingship. Even the art of lying were born from Enki's hands and set into motion like instruments in a great orchestra. In this, Enki stands apart from other gods of his age. He was not feared so much as consulted. His temples were places of healing and instruction, filled with the scent of water and the sound of tablets being etched. It is said that Enki's wisdom first expressed itself through language, that mysterious bridge between thought and world. In Mesopotamian belief, words themselves were living things. To speak was to create. To write was to preserve the spark of creation in form. In the city of Eridu, this reverence for word and sign evolved into one of humanity's most extraordinary inventions, writing. The earliest cuneiform tablets, marked with wedge-shaped impressions, record not only trade or law, but hymns to the God who made understanding possible in these clay inscriptions. We glimpse a moment when the divine and the human were intertwined. The stylus pressing into wet clay mirrored the hand of Enki pressing wisdom into the world. From Enki's waters flowed not only the irrigation that sustained the fields, But the metaphysical current that shaped the human mind, Enki, was also known by another name, Ea, he whose home is water. In later Babylonian traditions, his image evolved, but his essence remained. He was the benevolent counterbalance to Enlil, the stern lord of air and authority. Where Enlil set the laws, Enki found their exceptions. Where Enlil punished, Enki pardoned. This duality reflected a profound truth in Mesopotamian thought, the tension between order and compassion, justice and mercy. One of the oldest flood stories, predating even the biblical narrative, tells of Enki's quiet rebellion. When the gods decided to destroy humankind for its noise and disobedience, Enki could not bear the injustice. Through a whisper in a reed wall, he warned immortal Ziosudra to build a vessel and preserve life. In that act of disobedience, Enki preserved not only humanity but the continuity of wisdom itself. He demonstrated that divine knowledge was not meant to destroy, but to renew. His followers understood this paradox well. To serve Enki was to walk between reverence and reason, faith and inquiry. His temples were centers of both spiritual and scientific pursuit, a rare synthesis that still echoes in the foundations of human culture. The priests of Uruk, dressed in linen robes, performed water rituals before dawn. They washed their hands and mouths, believing that clarity of thought required purity of body. The act of drawing water from the Abzu was itself a meditation, a communion with the hidden source of all intellect. In their records, they noted the cycles of Venus, the paths of rivers, the alignments of stars, all reflections of Enki's patterns in nature. Their measurements became the basis for mathematics and astronomy as we know them. Each discovery was a form of devotion. Each observation a quiet hymn to the God who taught them to look deeper. Scholars have long noted how Enki's myths mirror the earliest philosophical ideas. Knowledge in these stories is not separate from the sacred, it is the sacred. The pursuit of understanding was not arrogance, but gratitude. When Enki crafted humankind from clay and divine essence, he did so with care, shaping not only bodies but minds capable of curiosity. That curiosity, our need to ask, to measure, to name, as his enduring gift. And perhaps, in a subtle way, his presence never left us. The rivers we cross, the wells we dig, the calculations we make, they all flow from that same ancient impulse to understand. Even the act of remembering him now, through stories and study, is an echo of that divine currenta, small ripple returning to its source. There is a calm wisdom in the image of Enki seated upon his throne. Waters streaming from his shoulders, fish swimming between his feet. Around him, symbols of reeds and flowing rivers, representing abundance and intellect intertwined. He does not command the storm or the sun. He rules the hidden depths. And in those depths, truth moves slowly, reshaping everything it touches. The ancient Sumerians knew that knowledge, like water, can cleanse but also drown. It must be approached with reverence, not pride. For wisdom is not a possession. It is a flow in the quiet halls of Eridu, long buried under the silt of time. Archaeologists have uncovered layered ruined temples, built one atop another, each older than the last. At the heart of these remains, they found traces of wells, channels, and altars shaped like pools. Even after 5,000 years, the message endures. Beneath every civilization lies a spring of questions. Was Enki merely a myth, or a memory of an age when knowledge and spirituality were one and the same? And if the Abzu was the source of all wisdom, Does it still flow beneath us, unseen, waiting for those willing to listen to its depth? Chapter 6. The birth of cuneiform prayer long before the marble temples of Greece or the Psalms of Jerusalem. Before the prayers of incense and cathedral bells, there was clay. Simple, unpolished clay, soft beneath the thumb, firm beneath the stylus, in the cradle of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates flowed like the veins of creation. The first written prayers were pressed into this earth, not sung aloud to vast congregations, not shouted to the heavens, but inscribed in silence, line by line, wedge by wedge. Each mark was deliberate, each word an act of faith. The earliest writing known to humanity, cuneiform, was born not merely to count grain or record trade, but to communicate with the divine. By 2500 BCE, in temples across Sumer, priests began using the same system that tracked harvests to preserve their hymns, invocations, and offerings. The stylus, once a tool of administration, became an instrument of prayer, and the clay tablet, once a ledger, became a sacred medium between earth and heaven. It was a quiet revolution in those lines. The human voice reached beyond sound, beyond breath. Words that once vanished into air could now endure. The prayers of one moment could now echo through centuries. In the temple archives of Nippur, Ur, and Eridu, archaeologists have uncovered thousands of these tablets. Some are broken, some weathered by time. Yet even in fragments, their devotion remains clear. One hymn to the goddess Inanna reads, "Lady of the evening, radiant and strong, your heart is great, your word surpasses heaven. When you look upon the people, they live." The tone is intimate, not fearful. It speaks of admiration, of longing, of gratitude. Through such lines, we sense the beginnings of theology not as dogma, but as conversation. The Mesopotamian worldview was deeply relational. Every god had their domain, and every act of worship was a form of correspondence to Enlil. One prayed for guidance and authority, to Enki for wisdom and cleansing, to Inanna, the moon god, for cycles of time and fertility. But these weren't distant beings. They were present in wind, in river, in fire. The priest or supplicant who inscribed a prayer onto clay did not imagine sending words upward into the sky. Instead, they believed they were anchoring them, fixing them into the very substance of the world. A prayer written on clay was not a message sent, it was a covenant sealed. The language of these prayers reveals something remarkable. They were often written in a tone of humility, even repentance. One ancient penitential psalm begins, "My God, the wrong I have done, I do not know. The sin I have committed, I do not know. My Lord, calm your heart toward me." It is one of the first recorded confessions in human history. There is no plea for power, no promise of wealth, only a wish for peace in these lines. One can feel the birth of conscience itself, the recognition that the divine might not only bless, but forgive. The act of writing a prayer was itself a ritual of purification. Before dawn, the temple scribes, of fond men of learning and discipline, would wash their hands in sacred water. They would sit upon reed mats, facing the statue or emblem of their god in silence. They would prepare the clay, smoothing it, removing its imperfections. Then, with a triangular reed stylus, they would begin pressing signs into its surface. Each wedge was made with intention, its rhythm almost meditative. Once finished, the tablet would be dried or baked and placed within the temple archives, sometimes alongside offerings of bread, oil, or incense. The words were not for public reading. They were meant to exist, to be, to simply rest in the presence of the divine. Through these acts, the written word gained spiritual weight. It was not merely a record, it was a vessel of the sacred. Over time, cuneiform prayer evolved into a literary art form. Sumerian hymns gave way to Akkadian laments, Babylonian psalms, and later Assyrian invocations. Each new civilization inherited the belief that words, when preserved, could bind heaven and earth. This is why Mesopotamian kings, too, began to inscribe their prayers in stone. They sought not only political legitimacy but divine remembrance. A ruler's words, fixed in enduring form, could act as a bridge between their reign and eternity. King Gudea of Lagash, around 2100 BC, wrote of how a god appeared to him in a dream and instructed him to build a temple. His tablets record his reverence and fear, but also his awe at being chosen. "My king, your command I have written in my heart. May the brick I lay be pleasing to your spirit." Even in stone-hard language, there is a tenderness and awareness of fragility, of gratitude. As writing spread, prayer followed. In Babylon, the priests of Marduk developed elaborate rituals of recitation and inscription. They believed that divine words could be copied, like a flame shared from one lamp to another, ever diminished, only multiplied. This idea, the transmissibility of holiness through text, would become one of Mesopotamia's greatest legacies. It laid the groundwork for every sacred scripture that followed. From cuneiform hymns came the idea of canon. From temple archives came the idea of revelation recorded. And from the first clay confessions came the idea that repentance could be written into the world itself. There is also a quiet beauty in how the material of prayer clay reflected human nature. The Sumerians believed mankind was shaped from the same earth, molded by divine hands. So when one pressed their words into clay, they were returning a fragment of their soul to its origin. To write was to remember what they were made of. This connection between body, earth, and word gave prayer a tangible intimacy. The voice of devotion was not abstract, had texture, weight, and permanence. Even the physical wear of time on these tablets has become part of their message. Many bear cracks and missing lines, as though devotion itself erodes, yet endures. Each fragment becomes a metaphor for the persistence of faith across millennia. Scholars often note how these prayers blur the line between poetry and philosophy. They reflect an early attempt to articulate what cannot be seen, to name mystery without claiming to control it. The scribes who composed them understood something timeless, that language, when consecrated, becomes a mirror. It shows not the face of the gods, but the shape of human longing. And perhaps this is why their words still move us. They carry the pulse of an ancient humility, a recognition that wisdom begins not with certainty, but with wonder. When we read these tablets today in museums or digital archives, we are reading voices from more than 4,000 years ago, and yet they sound familiar. The tone of regret, the plea for peace, the gratitude for Lytle remain deeply human. It reminds us that prayer did not begin as a demand for miracles, but as an act of remembering, a way to place one's hope into something enduring. Clay was never meant to last forever, yet somehow it did. And through it, so did the voice of devotion. So when the stylus met the tablet, when the scribe pressed meaning into mud, something unprecedented occurred. Worship became immortal, for the first time in history. The sacred could be read, preserved, and shared. The silent spaces between wedges carried the breath of the unseen, even now. Those tablets whisper through museum glass soft echoes from a civilization that understood how fragile life is, and how powerful a single prayer can be when given form. Perhaps that was always the purpose of writing, not to remember what was said, but to ensure that someone would listen, even if the gods had long since fallen silent. Chapter 7. The Temple of Inanna. The cradle of the world, where rivers met and civilizations began, stood a temple unlike any other. Its walls shimmered with carvings of lions and stars, its pillars wound with gold leaf and lapis stone. Within it, silence was not emptiness. It was invitation. The air held the scent of myrrh, honey, and the steady rhythm of drums. This was the house of Inanna, goddess of love and war, fertility and fury, chaos and creation. To enter her temple was to step into contradiction. She was tenderness and storm, the mother and the warrior, the seductress and the judge. To serve Inanna was to understand that divinity was not one thing, it was everything. And her priests and priestesses lived this truth with their entire being. They were known as Gala, sacred attendants who danced between gender and form. Some were men who lived as women, others women who took on the roles of men. Many were neither, or both, or something beyond. In the Sumerian language, their titles carried no shame. They were simply those who belonged to the goddess. Within the temple courts, they sang hymns in voices said to move the gods. Their music rose in crescents of ecstasy, descending again into whispers. To the people of Sumer, these singers were not outsiders, they were essential. They carried the emotional language of worship, the bridge between human longing and divine presence. Inanna herself was the goddess of polarity. In her myths, she rises to the heavens to claim dominion, then descends into the underworld to confront her own shadow. Her story is not one of purity, but of wholeness, of what happens when light meets its reflection. Her lovers were kings and shepherds, her rivals were gods and sisters, and her temple became the center of a mystery that mirrored life itself, the tension between creation and destruction, love and loss, power and surrender in the city of Uruk. Her great ziggurat rose above the plain. From its terraces, the priests watched the stars, reading her moods in Venus, the morning and evening star that appeared and disappeared with a rhythm like breath. When Venus vanished from the sky, it was said that Inanna had descended into the underworld. When it returned, she had been reborn. The heavens became her mirror. Astronomy became theology. Inside the sanctuary, rituals blurred the boundaries between the sacred and the sensual. Offerings of perfume and fruit were laid at her altar. Her devotees bathed in scented oils, their bodies painted in ochre and gold. To modern eyes, this might seem strange, but to the ancients, the body was not separate from the soul. Desire was not sin. It was the spark of creation itself. To touch, to dance, to feel, all were ways to commune with the goddess. The festival of Inanna was a time when kings themselves were humbled. In the rite of sacred marriage, the ruler of the city would symbolically unite with her high priestess, an act meant not for pleasure, but renewal. Through this union, the fertility of the land, the rhythm of the seasons, and the harmony of the cosmos were restored. It was not merely a ceremony of flesh. It was a reenactment of cosmic order. Her temple hymns survive even today, fragments carved on clay tablets, songs written in the world's first script. In one, the priestess Enheduanna, the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, speaks directly to her goddess, queen of all the divine powers. resplendent light who guides all the lands. To you I raise my prayer. Enheduanna's voice reaches across 5,000 years. She was not only a priestess, but the first known author in human history. Her words, preserved in cuneiform, reveal a faith that was deeply personal, yet cosmically vast. A relationship with the divine that was intimate, emotional, and alive to the followers of Inanna. Emotion itself was holy. Joy, grief, desire, rage, all were forms of offering. Nothing in the human experience was excluded from the divine conversation. The temple was a place of music and tears, of ritualized mourning and ecstatic dance. In its heart stood not a statue of still perfection, but a symbol of eternal transformation. Inanna's dual nature made her both feared and adored. She could raise kings to glory, then cast them into ruin. She could bless the fields with rain, then withhold her favor until the soil cracked. But she was never seen as cruel, only true. To know her was to know life in its full intensity. Her descent into the underworld remains one of the oldest recorded myths of death and rebirth. Stripped of her power, her crown, her jewels, she faced the dark mirror of her own being. It is said she hung lifeless for 3 days and nights before rising again. This myth would echo through later faiths in the death of Osiris, the trials of Persephone, and even the resurrection stories that came millennia later. Inanna was the first to walk this path, to die, descend, and return bearing wisdom within the temple. This story was not simply told, it was lived. Each ritual descent mirrored her own. Initiates would enter darkness, fasting and weeping, before emerging again into light and music. It was a spiritual enactment of death to the old self and awakening into renewal. Even in ancient art, her symbols spoke of paradox. The lion, representing her ferocity; the 8-pointed star, her celestial power; the reeds and rivers, her nurturing nature; and the mirror, the sacred emblem of reflection, reminding every worshipper that to see the goddess was to see oneself. Today, little remains of her temples. The ziggurats have crumbled, the hymns lie scattered in museums, and the statues are faceless fragments. Yet her story endures, not just in myth, but in the human psyche. Wherever there is passion that births creation, wherever dualities seek balance, there she is. Perhaps that is why Inanna still resonates across centuries. She embodies what we often resist, that to be whole, we must embrace both our softness and our fire, the sacred and the sensual, the descent and the return. Her temple was more than a building of stone. It was an idea that within each soul lies a divine polarity. That transformation requires surrender, and that every descent into darkness holds the seed of rising again. In the quiet of that ancient sanctuary, one truth remains. To know the goddess was not to escape life, but to enter it completely. And so, as the drums fade and the incense burns low, a final question lingers in the air. When you look into your own reflection, who descends and who returns? Chapter 8: Descent into the Underworld in the Temples of Ancient Sumer. The story of Inanna's descent was not simply recited, it was lived. To the priests and priestesses who served her, this myth was not tragedy, but initiation. It was the map of transformation, a sacred script that whispered the deepest truth of human existence, that renewal can only be born from surrender. They called her Queen of Heaven and Earth. But even a queen must one day face the shadow of her own reflection. The myth begins not with conquest or glory, but with a quiet, deliberate choice. Inanna, adorned in her royal garments, decides to leave her throne and descend into the great below, the land ruled by her sister, Ereshkigal, the queen of the dead. It is said that before she began her descent, she gathered 7 divine powers: her crown, her necklace, her breastplate, her bracelets, each symbol of her earthly authority. And as she passed through the 7 gates of the underworld, one by one, she was stripped of them all. At each threshold, the gatekeeper demanded she remove a piece of her glory. By the time she stood before her sister, Inanna was naked, humbled, and silent to the ancients. This was not humiliation, it was purification. Each gate represented a layer of illusion, the things the soul must surrender to meet truth without disguise. The descent was not punishment. It was a passage through the shedding of pride, power, and form, toward the stillness at the heart of being. The underworld, or Kor as it was known, was not imagined as a place of fiery torment, but as a realm of silence and shadow, a mirror world beneath the living one. It was cold and still, filled with the whisper of dust and the weight of eternity. To the people of Sumer, death was not annihilation. It was transition, but Inanna's descent revealed something more profound, that even within death, there is divine purpose. The priests of her temple recited this myth during the rites of the new year, a time when the world itself seemed to die and be reborn. The land was dry, the fields bare, and the rivers slow. But they believed that just as Inanna descended, so too did the fertility of the earth retreat beneath the soil. When she rose again, life would follow in this way. Her myth became the heartbeat of the seasons, a reflection of the endless cycle of decay and renewal that governed both nature and the soul. To the followers of Inanna, her silence in the underworld was sacred. It was said that in the stillness of her absence, the heavens trembled. Her lover Dumuzi mourned her, the gods wept, and the balance of the world faltered. The priesthood taught that this silence was not despair, but devotion, the moment when the soul listens instead of speaks, when it ceases striving and simply is. In their rituals, initiates would sometimes enter chambers of darkness, fasting and praying, symbolically retracing the goddess's path. They would lay aside ornaments, robes, and names, reciting prayers of release. To die before dying, this was the meaning of the descent. Scholars believe these rites may have inspired later initiatory traditions, echoes found in the mysteries of Egypt, in Greek Eleusis, even in early Gnostic thought. The pattern is the same: descent, death, and return. It is the architecture of spiritual renewal itself. The story continues that when Inanna finally reached her sister, Ereshkigal struck her down. For 3 days and nights, the Queen of Heaven hung lifeless on a hook in the great below. The world above fell into mourning. The rivers dried, the wombs of women were barren, and no prayers were answered. Only when the god Enki, the keeper of wisdom, sent help from above, did the cycle shift. He fashioned 2 beings from the dust beneath his fingernails, creatures neither male nor female, who entered the underworld unseen. They offered compassion to Ereshkigal, who was writhing in the pain of her own solitude. Moved by their empathy, she granted them one wish. They asked for the body of Inanna, sprinkling her with the waters of life. They restored her. The priests would pause here when telling the story, for this was the moment of the first resurrection in recorded myth, a divine return from death, not through force, but through compassion. Inanna rose, but she did not return unchanged. Something of the underworld remained within her, an awareness of limits, a wisdom born from silence. To rise, she had to bring balance between the two sisters, between the upper and lower worlds, the living and the dead, the seen and the unseen. In temple philosophy, the descent became a spiritual diagram. Each gate corresponded to an aspect of the human condition: pride, attachment, fear, desire, identity, memory, and form. To move through them was to confront what binds us. To emerge on the other side was to awaken, not as a deity, but as one who remembers what is eternal. When the myth was recited, it was often accompanied by soft drums and slow chants. The rhythm of the performance mirrored the journey itself, a gradual descent into quiet, a pause in darkness, and a slow rising into sound again. To the listener, it was more than a story. It was a mirror of their own inner passage. Everyone would one day descend, not necessarily to a physical underworld, but into the depths of themselves. Inanna's myth held no promise of escape from death, no guarantee of eternal bliss. What it offered instead was understanding that the path to wholeness runs through surrender, that only by entering the unknown can life be renewed. Later, cultures would reinterpret this story in their own forms. In Egypt, Isis mourned Osiris and restored him. In Greece, Persephone descended each year to dwell with Hades before returning to the sunlight. In early Christianity, the descent motif reappears in the idea of the harrowing of hell. But the Sumerians were among the first to record it, to put into words that mysterious truth felt by all living beings, that something must die for something new to live. In the temple schools of Nippur and Uruk, the myth was not taught as history, but as inner philosophy. Each gate, one tablet reads, is a letting go. And perhaps that is the most enduring wisdom of Inanna's descent. That transformation does not come from accumulation, but release. The journey inward, whether through ritual, grief, or silence, is not a fall, it is a return. When the priests performed her ascent, they would reopen the temple doors, letting sunlight spill across the altar. The scent of incense mixed with the first warmth of spring air. The hymns that followed were gentle, filled with gratitude. The world had been renewed once again. To the modern listener, the myth still speaks, not as a relic of belief, but as a reflection of our own descent into the depths of experience, into loss, into change, into silence. It reminds us that the way through darkness is not resistance, but acceptance. And when the story ends, it does not end in triumph, but in balance. For Inanna is not simply reborn. She becomes both light and shadow, heaven and underworld, giver and taker. She teaches that every descent, whether of a soul, a civilization, or a single breath, holds within it the rhythm of return. And so, her temple stood as a reminder that death, in its deepest form, is not an ending. It is a gesture of devotion, the soul bowing before what it cannot yet understand. Somewhere beneath the dust of Uruk, where her ziggurat once caught the morning light, her story still hums in the silence of buried stone. It asks, as softly now as it did then, when all else has been stripped away, what remains of you that is truly alive? Chapter 9. Dreams and the Voice of the Gods. In the cities of ancient Mesopotamia, sleep was not merely rest. It was an opening, a threshold between worlds, where the voice of the divine could slip through the quiet spaces of the mind. To the Sumerians and Babylonians, dreams were not private illusions or wandering thoughts. They were sacred transmissions, messages from the gods delivered in the fragile hours of night. A dream could heal, warn, command, or reveal what reason could not see. It was said that the gods spoke most clearly when the human tongue was silent. The temples of Nippur and Babylon each kept chambers dedicated to this purpose. Their priests, trained in the art of dream interpretation, the Baru and Urpu studied symbols, omens, and the behavior of the sleeping soul. Their task was not to explain dreams, but to translate them, to bring the speech of the invisible into human understanding. Clay tablets, thousands of years old, have preserved their records. Some describe the dreams of kings and generals, others those of farmers or merchants who sought divine guidance before journeys or disputes. Entire archives were dedicated to these nocturnal messages. Libraries of the night mind. One such collection, known today as the Ikazak, or the series of the dream, gathered hundreds of examples. If a man dreams that he drinks sweet water, it is a good omen, the god is satisfied. If he dreams that fire falls from heaven, it is a warning of war. If he dreams that his house collapses, it is the sign of new beginnings. To the modern ear, these may sound like superstition, but to the people of that world, dreams were a living bridge, part of a sacred communication system that bound humanity to the divine. The Mesopotamians believed that each person had a spirit double, a subtle counterpart that could travel while the body rested. During sleep, this essence wandered through the unseen realm, meeting gods, ancestors, and spirits who could whisper truths unavailable to the waking mind. When the dreamer awoke, it was as if the night had spoken softly. In symbols, kings often sought counsel from dream interpreters before waging war or issuing new laws. The ruler Gudea of Lagash claimed that the god Ningasu appeared to him in a dream, instructing him to build a temple. He awoke, gathered the priests, and they reconstructed every detail of the vision in clay and stone. That temple would stand as one of the earliest known monuments inspired by a dream. Later, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, dreams served as both warning and revelation. Before Gilgamesh met the wild man Enkidu, he dreamed of a meteor that fell to earth, radiant and immovable, a sign, said the priests, of the companion who would change his life. In another dream, the mountains fell and the sky roared, omens of mortality and the futility of pride. Through dreams, even the mightiest were reminded, the gods still held the final word. The priesthood took this dialogue seriously. Before sleeping, a person seeking guidance might perform a ritual known as incubation. They would bathe, offer incense, and lie down within a temple courtyard or near a sacred statue, hoping that the god would visit them in the night. Upon waking, they would recount every image to the attending priest, who recorded it carefully in cuneiform and sought its meaning in the temple archives. Dreams were considered layered. The outer image was symbolic, but the inner pattern revealed divine will. A river might symbolize change, a lion, divine strength or royal favor. To dream of standing before the temple gates was a call to spiritual renewal. Each symbol carried echoes of older stories drawn from myth, ritual, and cosmic order. Anthropologists now see this system as one of the first attempts to catalogue the subconscious, not in psychological terms, but spiritual ones. The Mesopotamians believed that the human mind was a mirror of the cosmos, and that dreams reflected its shifting light. There were, however, dangerous dreams too, those sent by malevolent spirits or restless dead. The Artipu, or exorcist priests, would perform rites to cleanse the dreamer, burning juniper or sprinkling water from the sacred rivers. Even nightmares were part of the dialogue. Their darkness was simply another way the gods demanded attention. Across centuries, this belief evolved but never faded. In the Assyrian and Babylonian empires, dream omens were used to guide state decisions. Temple scribes compiled massive reference lists describing thousands of dream scenarios. They did not see dreaming as randomness, but as divine pattern, a nightly form of communication written in shifting imagery. And always, the priests stood as interpreters, the translators of the unseen. There's something profoundly human in that. The desire to find meaning in what feels mysterious. To wake from the dark silence of sleep and wonder, what was that trying to tell me? Even today, that impulse endures. We wake from strange dreams and search for symbols, rivers, animals, lost voices, places we've never been. The language has changed, but the longing is the same. To the ancient Mesopotamians, this was not superstition, but participation. To dream was to share in the work of the gods, to receive a fragment of their awareness, if only for a moment. One cuneiform prayer, found near Babylon, reads, "Let me see in dream the word of my God. Let the vision come clear like light through water. Let me understand." That longing to see clearly, to understand, may be the oldest kind of prayer in their worldview. Prophecy often began in this space between dreaming and waking. Many prophets, scribes, and healers claimed that their visions were born not from waking revelation, but from dreams. The God spoke, they said, in the language of sleep, because the mind, freed from reason, could finally listen. And from those dream-born whispers came decisions that shaped kingdoms. Temples were built, wars were avoided, laws were written. The first seeds of recorded prophecy began to take root. The idea that the divine communicates not only through nature or ritual, but directly through the intimate theater of the human mind. When archaeologists first uncovered the dream tablets, they found something unexpected. The entries were not written like myths or hymns, but like journals, plain, observational, almost scientific. A man dreamed of a storm, and his harvest failed. A woman dreamed of a serpent, and she bore a child. Each line a note in humanity's first study of the unconscious. Behind those careful records lies something quietly beautiful. A civilization listening to its own inner world. They understood that the night was not empty. It was full of messages, if one only learned how to read them today. Psychology has replaced priesthood, and the dream interpreter's temple has become the therapist's office. Yet the purpose remains similar: to bridge the inner and outer worlds, to understand what our deeper selves are trying to say. And so, as night falls, we continue the same ancient ritual. We close our eyes, we surrender to the unknown, and somewhere in that space between breath and silence, images begin to rise from a place older than memory. Perhaps that is why dreams still move us, because they remind us that we are more than waking beings, that we live between worlds, the visible and the invisible, the known and the mysterious. To the people of Mesopotamia, that mystery was not something to be solved. It was to be honored. The dream was the divine whisper, a message gentle enough not to break the stillness of the night, but clear enough to awaken the soul. And when morning came, and the clay tablets were inscribed with what had been seen, the priests would often end their record with a simple note: "The God has spoken." But perhaps, across the thousands of years that separate us from those sleeping scribes, The question still lingers. When you dream, who or what is it that's trying to speak? Chapter 10. The Law of Hammurabi and the Priests' Seal in Ancient Mesopotamia. Justice was not an invention of kings. It was a reflection of heaven, a divine order set into the clay of human life. The Sumerians, Babylonians, and Assyrians did not imagine law as a creation of men sitting in council. They saw it as a thread that already existed, spun by the gods long before the first city rose beside the Euphrates. To them, justice was sacred geometry, every rule, every punishment, every oath an attempt to mirror the balance of the cosmos. When King Hammurabi ascended the throne of Babylon around 1792 BC, he did not see himself as a lawmaker in the modern sense. He was, rather, a translator of divine order, the earthly voice of Shamash, the god of justice and light. His task was to bring celestial balance into the shifting dust of human affairs. The famous basalt stele that bears his laws still stands today, inscribed with nearly 300 decrees. At its crown is a carving of Hammurabi standing before Shamash. The god is seated upon a mountain, rays of light rising from his shoulders. In his hands, he offers the king a rod and a ring, symbols of measurement and authority. This was not the image of a ruler receiving advice. It was a ritual transmission. The rod was the measure of justice, the ring, the eternal cycle of divine law. By taking them, Hammurabi became a bridge between the heavens and the city walls. His code was not a political document, it was a covenant. Each clause carved into stone was meant to preserve harmony. The laws addressed merchants and midwives, farmers and judges, priests and slaves. If a man built a house that collapsed and killed its owner, his own life was forfeit. If a woman accused her husband falsely, she faced divine ordeal by the river. Contracts were sealed, not merely with wax, but with oaths sworn before the gods. Oaths that, if broken, could bring illness or ruin in every courtroom. The presence of the priest was not optional. It was essential. He was the keeper of the sacred seal, the one who ensured that judgment was not made by whim but by cosmic principle. The priest did not only observe, he consecrated. His words transformed human verdicts into divine decrees. Through his seal, often impressed on clay tablets beside the written judgment, the decision became binding in both worlds, the world of men and the unseen realm that governed fate. Mesopotamian courts were often built beside temples, under the watch of statues representing the gods themselves. Witnesses were instructed to swear upon idols of Marduk, Ishtar, or Shamash, touching the figures before giving testimony. The divine presence was never abstract. It was physical, embodied in stone and symbol. Justice, then, was an act of ritual as much as reason. Each judgment reenacted the original balance of creation, when the gods separated light from darkness, order from chaos. But behind these laws, there was fear, not of kings, but of imbalance. The Mesopotamians believed that injustice disturbed the cosmic order, provoking droughts, floods, or the collapse of dynasties. A corrupt judge was not just a criminal. He was a breaker of worlds, and so the priestly class became the guardians of that balance. They recorded disputes on clay tablets, catalogued debts and oaths, and preserved archives of human behavior. In the temple of Inanna at Uruk, scholars have discovered hundreds of tablets detailing fines, contracts, and verdicts, the spiritual bureaucracy of an entire civilization. Each case, in its own way, was a fragment of theology. For the Mesopotamians, justice and piety were one and the same. To obey the law was to honor the gods. To defy it was to invite disorder, the same primordial chaos that the creation myths said had once threatened to swallow the world. And yet, even in their reverence for divine order, the people of Babylon knew that the universe could be capricious. The river might rise unexpectedly. A righteous man could lose his harvest. The innocent might fall ill while the guilty prospered. This tension between cosmic law and human uncertainty haunted Mesopotamian thought. It appears in their prayers, their hymns, their lamentations. The prayer to every god pleads forgiveness for sins the worshipper cannot name, acknowledging that the divine mind is beyond human understanding. The ways of the gods are dark. One Sumerian proverb laments, "Who can know them?" In this uncertainty, the priests found their purpose, their rituals, their seals, their careful interpretations. All were attempts to read the will of the divine in an unpredictable world. When an eclipse darkened the sky, when crops withered, when the Tigris overflowed its banks, the temple would perform ceremonies of atonement. Law and ritual became two sides of the same practice, restoring alignment for Hammurabi. Law was a reflection of divine symmetry, but even he recognized that justice was a living thing. It required continual care. His code ends not with finality, but with invocation. Blessings for those who uphold the laws, curses for those who alter them. The last lines read almost like scripture. May the great gods who dwell in this temple curse him who does not observe my words, who changes my inscription. The stele, therefore, was not merely a monument. It was a spell, a carved invocation ensuring the endurance of moral order through generations. The seal of the priest, pressed into wet clay beside each ruling, became an earthly echo of that same spell. The circular impression symbolized eternity, the never-ending rotation of law and consequence. When a verdict was sealed, it meant the matter was bound within the cycle of divine justice. Yet, for all its solemnity, the system remained deeply human. Mercy appeared beside punishment. Some laws protected widows and orphans, required restitution instead of vengeance, and upheld the rights of workers and traders. In its rigidity, the Code of Hammurabi still reflected a society learning to balance retribution with compassion, the divine with the mortal dot, and beneath it all was a quiet understanding. No law, however sacred, could master fate. The Babylonians believed that destiny itself was written on the tablets of heaven, guarded by the gods. Even a perfectly lawful man could be struck by misfortune if his fate demanded it. The priest's seal could sanctify judgment, but it could not rewrite what the stars had already decreed. In this paradox, between divine justice and inscrutable destiny, lay the heart of Mesopotamian spirituality. The people sought order not because they believed it would save them from chaos, but because they feared it was the only way to coexist with it. Every verdict, every oath, every seal was a reminder. The world remains fragile. The divine light of Shamash could bless or burn, depending on how closely humanity walked in alignment with his will. And so the law endured, carved into stone, copied onto tablets, recited by priests, invoked by merchants and kings alike. It became the pulse of Mesopotamian civilization, the rhythm by which its people measured right and wrong, prosperity and punishment, sin and sanctity. To break an oath was to unweave a portion of the world. To uphold it was to rebuild creation, one act of justice at a time. The Code of Hammurabi was never simply about control. It was about connection between heaven and earth, between ruler and ruled, between mortal breath and divine order and still. As centuries passed and Babylon's temples fell silent, the black stele remained. The god's image still gazed down upon the king, and the carved laws still whispered of a time when morality was measured in sunlight and shadow. Perhaps that is why the inscription ends not with law, but with faith, the belief that justice, though fragile, echoes the harmony of the heavens. For even divine order, as the ancient priests once said, must bow someday to the mystery of fate. Chapter 11. The Sacred Marriage Rite in the Ancient Cities of Mesopotamia. The arrival of spring was more than a change of season. It was the reawakening of the world, the soft breathing of the earth after the long stillness of winter. Fields turned green again, rivers overflowed their banks, and in the temples, the people prepared for one of the most profound ceremonies of their faith, the sacred marriage rite. It was called Hieros Gamos, by later scholars, the Holy Union. But to the Sumerians and Babylonians, it was not merely a ritual. It was a renewal of creation itself. Through the symbolic union of a king and a priestess, the forces of heaven and earth were brought back into harmony. The rite told a cosmic story, one that had been whispered since the dawn of cities. The goddess Inanna, queen of heaven and lady of love and fertility, descended to the realm of men to unite with her chosen partner, Dumosi, the shepherd king. Their union ensured that the fields would bloom, the flocks would multiply, and the people would live under divine favor. To the ancient mind, such myths were not distant allegories. They were living patterns woven into the rhythm of time. If the gods had once joined to make the world fertile, then their bond must be renewed again and again through ritual, through offering, through human embodiment. And so, each year, as the stars shifted and the rains returned, the temple prepared for the sacred marriage. The ceremony took place in the ziggurats and temples, dedicated to Inanna, later known as Ishtar, where the high priestess, often called the Entu, embodied the goddess herself. The king, representing Dumuzi, entered the temple purified and anointed, dressed in ceremonial robes. Before the assembled priests, musicians, and attendants, the two enacted a sacred drama, a ritualized courtship that mirrored divine passion. Clay tablets from Uruk and Nippur preserve hymns recited during the rite. One begins, "Bridegroom, dear to my heart, goodly is your beauty. Lion, I will lie down with you, let us spend the night in ecstasy." These were not mere words of romance. They were invocations. Each line was believed to awaken the sleeping powers of nature, to call the goddess of fertility back into the fields and rivers. The priestess offered wine and bread, symbolic of abundance. The king pledged his strength and justice to the land. In some interpretations, their union was physical, an act performed in sanctity within the temple's inner chamber. In others, it remained symbolic, represented by ritual offerings and sacred verse. Whatever its form, the meaning was the same, the alignment of opposites, masculine and feminine, heaven and earth, mortality and divinity. In the ancient worldview, balance was not a philosophical concept, it was survival. The flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates brought life, but also destruction. To ensure harmony, the forces of creation had to be continually appeased, renewed, and woven together. The sacred marriage was the means through which that fragile equilibrium was restored. For the people who gathered outside the temple walls, the ceremony was a reassurance. The sight of their king participating in divine union meant that the gods still remembered them. The grain would grow, the herds would thrive. The storms would come, but so would the harvest. And through this ritual, the king's authority was sanctified. His reign was not merely political, it was cosmic. By uniting with the goddess, he proved that his rule was favored by the heavens. His justice, his victories, even his survival, were seen as reflections of divine order. The priestess, too, was no ordinary figure. Chosen from noble or sacred lineages, she lived much of her life within the temple, in devotion and preparation. She studied hymns, astrology, and the sacred laws of the gods. Her body was seen as a vessel through which the divine could act. To her, the rite was not performance, it was incarnation. For a single night, she became an antidote in this merging of human and divine roles. The ceremony blurred the boundaries between mythology and reality. The people below the temple steps would hear the chanting rise into the night, mingling with the scent of incense and the low hum of drums. To them, this was not symbolic theater. It was a reenactment of the world's renewal, a moment when heaven descended and earth reached upward to meet it. Ancient texts describe processions following the rite. The next morning, the king would appear before the citizens crowned and radiant, a living sign that the sacred union had been fulfilled. Offerings of fruit, grain, and flowers filled the temples. The city would celebrate with feasts and music. Life itself seemed to begin again. But within the ceremony lay deeper theology, a philosophy of duality and return in the myth. Inanna and Dumoze's love was not without sorrow. After their union, Dumoze was fated to descend into the underworld, a symbol of the dying season. His eventual return each spring mirrored the cycle of vegetation, the death and rebirth of the natural world. Thus, the sacred marriage was not only about fertility and abundance, but also about the acceptance of impermanence. It reminded the people that all things, even divine unions, pass through darkness before returning to light. This rhythm of death and renewal shaped much of Mesopotamian religion. It echoed in the agricultural cycles, in the rites of mourning and resurrection, and in later faiths that drew from these ancient stories. One could hear its echoes. Centuries later, in the Canaanite worship of Baal and Inanna, in the Greek mysteries of Demeter and Persephone, and even in the sacred unions described in early Gnostic texts, all reflections of an idea first cultivated beside the Mesopotamian rivers, that life depends on the meeting and partying of opposites. Scholars today interpret the sacred marriage through many lenses as political propaganda, agricultural ritual, or spiritual allegory. But to the people who lived by its rhythm, it was simply truth made visible. The union of goddess and king was the heartbeat of the world. Even the language of their prayers reveals this sense of intimacy between heaven and earth. A hymn from the city of Ur declares, "The goddess fills the womb of the land, the fields are pregnant with grain. The shepherd rejoices, the people lift their eyes to the mountain." Every action, every symbol, from the pouring of oil to the clasping of hands, reflected that divine fertility. And yet, beyond the ritual's outer beauty, there lingers a quiet question. Did the people truly believe that gods descended into human form? Or was the ceremony itself, the descent, a moment where belief became tangible and the unseen world brushed against the mortal one? Perhaps it didn't matter. For them, the separation between divine and human was never absolute. The temple was a threshold, the ritual a bridge. In a sense, the sacred marriage was less about passion and more about remembrance. A reminder that creation is not complete, that it must be renewed each season, each generation, through alignment, reverence, and love. As the years passed and empires shifted, the ritual faded. New gods rose, and new religions reinterpreted the mystery. But its essence, the joining of heaven and earth through devotion, endured in countless forms. In altars and marriages, in blessings over fields. In prayers for rain, the Mesopotamians believed that the strength of a civilization depended not on conquest, but on harmony between ruler and ruled, between nature and spirit, between male and female. The sacred marriage was the ritual language of that harmony. When the ceremony ended and the incense smoke drifted into the night, the city returned to its life, markets reopened, children played by the riverbanks, and farmers began their sowing. Yet the people knew that something unseen had shifted. The goddess had smiled upon them once more, and for another year, the world would grow, perhaps even now. As we read the hymns carved into clay thousands of years ago, some echo of that ritual still lives, the sense that balance is fragile, and that creation must be tended through reverence and renewal, because to the ancients, the union of God and goddess was not just a myth of the past. It was the pulse of the present, the moment when heaven remembered the earth, and the earth, in return, remembered heaven. Chapter 12. Oracles of the Storm, Godin, the earliest cities of Mesopotamia, where the plains met the shifting skies. Thunder was never just weather. It was language, the voice of the divine, breaking across the horizon. The people called him Adad, the bringer of rain, the wielder of thunderbolts, the one whose moods could bless or destroy. To farmers, he was life itself. To kings, he was judgment. When the rains came too soon or too late, entire nations would tremble, for it meant the storm God had spoken, and perhaps had been angered at the heart of every storm they believed was intention. Temples to Adad rose across Assyria and Babylon, often on high ground where the wind never stopped moving. Their walls were marked with lightning symbols, and within them, priests waited for the voice of the sky. These were not readers of stars or interpreters of dreams. Theirs was a language of thunder, wind, and rain. They called themselves Musa, listeners of the storm. When clouds gathered, they would climb the temple stairs, carrying no offerings but silence. There, upon the terraces, they would stand beneath the trembling firmament. Every flash of lightning, every direction of wind, every distant roll of thunder was treated as a syllable in a divine sentence. The storm was not random. It was communication to them. Adad's storms were oracles, fierce, unpredictable, but never meaningless. In ancient cuneiform tablets, scribes recorded these interpretations with precision. Thunder from the north, one reads, is the warning of invasion. If lightning strikes on the day of the festival, the king's offering has been accepted. If rain falls without thunder, the gods are displeased, for the people have ceased to listen. The priests of Adad were trained not only in meteorology but in silence. They were taught that prophecy is not only in words but in patterns, the rhythm of rainfall, the distance between lightning and sound, the sudden break of wind that carried the scent of wet earth to them. Divination was not an act of control but of surrender. In the storms, chaos, they found reflection of the human world, violent, unpredictable, beautiful, and short-lived. They said Adad was both mercy and punishment. His rains fed the rivers, but his floods erased villages. His thunder could herald abundance or destruction. He was balance, and therefore sacred. Across the ancient Near East, his worship spread and evolved. The Akkadians called him Ish. The Hittites called him Teshub. The Canaanites knew him as Baal, the rider of the clouds. And though their languages differed, the image remained the same: a god standing atop mountains, holding the double lightning, roaring across the skies in every storm. Humanity projected both fear and awe, the two oldest emotions in the face of nature. The rituals of Adad often began in stillness. Priests would purify themselves with water and ash, then wait in darkness until the first sound of thunder cracked across the night. Candles were extinguished. Prayers were whispered, not shouted. They believed that to speak too loudly during a storm was to interrupt the divine. Inside the temples, the walls trembled with wind. The flicker of lightning illuminated carved reliefs of bulls, Adad's sacred animal symbolizing strength and fertility. Offerings of grain and honey were left before the altar, for the people knew that the same God who sent drought could also send the flood that saved their crops. It was a faith built on paradox, fear of destruction, hope for life. The oracles themselves were rarely direct. Adad did not speak in full sentences. He spoke in symbols, the same way the universe still does. The priests recorded each storm as a text. Over time, these weather prophecies formed archives, hundreds of clay tablets, mapping the relationship between sky and fate. Some were practical, others deeply spiritual. If the storm breaks over the palace, one tablet reads, "The king will triumph." If thunder rolls without lightning, the people must not travel for 7 days. If wind scatters the ashes of sacrifice, the gods have heard. Each note was a thread connecting heaven and earth, and in that connection lay something profound: the belief that nature was not separate from spirit. Today, we see weather as science patterns of pressure and temperature, but for thousands of years, it was the most direct evidence of a living cosmos. The storm, with all its violence, was proof that the divine was not abstract. It was tangible. It could be felt on the skin. When thunder echoed across the plains, ancient families paused their meals. Children were told to listen. Silence filled the rooms, not from fear, but reverence, because every sound of thunder was a question. What have we done to deserve this voice? Over time, the worship of Adad merged with that of other deities. His temples became shrines to new gods of weather and war. Yet even as the names changed, Teshub, Baal, Zeus, Jupiter, the essence remained. The human relationship to the storm has always been the same. Awe in the face of power. When the Israelites spoke of Yahweh's voice thundering from the mountain, they were echoing the same sentiment. When Greek poets described Zeus hurling bolts from Olympus, it was another retelling of the same ancient intuition that lightning is not random, that it means something, that somewhere within the roaring sky, consciousness moves. Even now, in our modern world, a storm has the power to stop us. We close windows, we watch from behind glass, and for a brief moment, the old instinct returns, that mix of fear and wonder that no civilization has ever fully forgotten. Perhaps that is why so many creation myths begin with chaos, the storm before order in the Mesopotamian Enuma Elish. Before gods and men, there was only water, wind and thunder, From that turbulence, the world was born. From that sound, the first silence emerged. And in that silence, humanity began to listen for the priests of Adad. Silence was sacred not because it lacked sound, but because it allowed meaning to be heard. After every storm, they would descend from the temple, record their interpretations, and wait for stillness to return. The calm after thunder was not relief, it was revelation. They believed that stillness was the other half of prophecy, because only in quiet could the echoes of the storm be understood. There is something deeply human in that cycle, chaos followed by reflection, fear followed by understanding, sound followed by silence. It mirrors our own inner storms, those moments of confusion or pain that, only afterward, reveal what they were trying to teach. Perhaps that is why the ancients turned their eyes upward. They saw in the sky not just weather, but a mirror of themselves. They understood that the voice of the divine is rarely soft, but it is always followed by calm, and in that calm, wisdom lingers. The priests of Adad are long gone. Their temples are dust, their tablets buried beneath centuries of silence. Yet each time thunder rolls across the world, we are hearing what they once heard, the same deep vibration of the cosmos, the same question without words, a question that no empire, no religion, no science has ever fully answered. When the storm speaks, what is it saying? And when it passes, are we still listening? Chapter 13. The astronomer-priests of Uruk. The deep silence of the Mesopotamian night, when the air was still and the earth cooled beneath the weight of its own history. A different kind of worship began. High atop the ziggurats of Uruk, men in linen robes stood beneath the open sky. They were not looking toward altars or idols, but upward to the infinite canopy of stars. To them, the heavens were not empty, they were alive. Each point of light was a word, and together they formed the great text of the gods. They were known as the astronomer-priests, the keepers of celestial order. Their work began long before dawn. In quiet observation, they charted the movements of Venus, Jupiter, and the moon. They marked the rising and setting of constellations, the first glimpse of a star after it disappeared for months beneath the sun's glare, and the precise moment the moon darkened and renewed itself. These were not abstract fascinations. To the priests of Uruk, every celestial motion reflected divine will. In the ancient worldview of Sumer and Babylon, heaven and earth were mirrors. What unfolded above found its echo below. The sky was a temple roof, vast and ordered, and to study it was to read the architecture of creation itself. They believed the gods communicated through cycles, the repetition of light and shadow, the return of certain stars, the slow turning of the seasons. Each planet had its deity, each constellation a story. Venus was Inanna, goddess of love and war, whose appearances and disappearances across the horizon were interpreted as her journeys to and from the underworld. Jupiter was Marduk, the lord of kingship. The moon, Sin, kept sacred time. The astronomer-priests watched these celestial beings with devotion, recording their paths in cuneiform on clay tablets. Over generations, their meticulous observations grew into a body of knowledge that became the foundation of astronomy, mathematics, and sacred timekeping. What began as worship slowly became science. From Uruk's temple towers, the inner precinct, the priests measured solstices and equinoxes. They learned how to predict eclipses, how to divide the year into seasons, and how to coordinate the agricultural cycles that sustained their civilization. The first calendars of the world were not administrative tools. They were acts of reverence. To track time was to participate in divine rhythm, to live in harmony with the movements of heaven. Through this celestial order, the astronomer-priests gave structure to the lives of their people. Festivals were aligned with the moon's phases, harvests were timed to the rising of constellations, and royal ceremonies were performed under auspicious skies. Even law and prophecy were guided by the heavens. If Mars appeared red and bright in the east, omens of conflict were recorded. If Jupiter shone steadily over the palace, peace was foretold. Every flicker, every shadow, every delay had meaning. For these priests, the night was not silent. It was filled with divine dialogue. They listened as others might pray. The city of Uruk, often called the birthplace of civilization, was more than brick and trade. It was a world of measured divinity. Its ziggurat, dedicated to Inanna, reached upward like a ladder between the human and the eternal. On its summit, the astronomer-priests read the stars, as one might read a sacred script, line by line, orbit by orbit. They called the stars the writing of heaven, each one a syllable in what they believed to be the cosmic grammar of the gods. When they pressed their records into clay, they were not merely documenting, they were preserving a covenant between heaven and earth. A record that humanity had seen, had noticed, and had tried to understand. It was said that through patience, the priests learned the music of eternity. This phrase, still echoed in fragments of Babylonian hymns, referred to the recognition that everything, from rainfall to the birth of a child, moved in cycles. The universe was not chaotic. It was rhythmic, and to live well was to learn that rhythm. In time, their calculations became astonishingly precise. They could predict lunar eclipses centuries in advance, and their sexagesimal base 60 system gave rise to how we still measure time: 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. The geometry of time, as they called it, was not an invention but a revelation, a reflection of divine symmetry. Each rotation of the stars was a reminder that order could be found even in the vast unknown. For the priests of Uruk, the act of watching the sky was an act of devotion, discipline, and humility. They saw themselves as mediators between divine order and human confusion, translators of the infinite. Their nights were long, their rituals precise. Before beginning their observations, they would purify themselves with water and anoint their foreheads with oil. They would wait in silence, allowing their eyes to adjust to the dark. The first star to appear, the planet Venus, was greeted with a prayer. They called it the torch of the gods. Its rising before dawn was considered a blessing, its disappearance a warning. Inanna, as Venus, was both radiant and unpredictable, capable of bringing fertility or war. The priests learned to trace her 584-day cycle, one of the earliest recorded planetary periods in history. Through her, they learned that divinity, like the heavens, was both constant and ever-changing. The more they studied, the more they realized that knowledge itself carried responsibility. To interpret a bad omen falsely could bring disaster. To conceal a sign of wrath could invite the gods' anger. The astronomer-priests walked a delicate path, part scientist, part philosopher, part servant of divine law. Their observations influenced kings and councils. Before a war, a ruler might ask them, "Are the heavens favorable?" Before a coronation, "Do the stars agree with my reign?" and the priests would answer, not with superstition, but with patterns, precedents, and memory. The stars had seen it all before. For them, history was cyclical. Kingdoms rose and fell in the same rhythm as constellations. Every return of a planet to its former place in the sky was a reminder that destiny, too, repeats in this eternal repetition. They found comfort because if the heavens could renew themselves endlessly, perhaps the human spirit could as well. Their writings, thousands of tablets from Uruk, Babylon, and Nineveh, survive as the earliest recorded study of the cosmos. Some describe purely observational data. Others combine mathematics with prayer. A few even blur the line between astronomy and theology, suggesting that understanding the stars was a way to know the divine mind. To them, faith and reason were never opposites. They were twins, both born from wonder, and wonder was the truest form of reverence. There is a quiet beauty in imagining those ancient nights. The vast Mesopotamian plains, a horizon unbroken by modern light, the slow arc of the moon over the Euphrates, the faint scratching of stylus against clay, the low murmur of a priest recording what he sees, the stars reflected in still water, as if heaven leaned down to meet its own image. Thousands of years later, their constellations remain: Taurus, Leo, Scorpius, mapped and named by these same early watchers. Every time a modern astronomer tracks the planets, they echo those same ancient gestures: the measuring, the noting, the awe. Science, in its deepest form, has never been separate from spirituality. It began as its expression. When the priests of Uruk lifted their eyes to the night, they were not trying to control the cosmos. They were trying to listen. They believed that through patience, a person could hear the quiet pattern beneath chaos, the pulse of eternity itself. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of all, that the universe does not hide its meaning. It only asks that we slow down long enough to see it. Every dawn, when the last star faded, the astronomer-priests would extinguish their lamps, record their findings, and descend the ziggurat stairs. Their night's work was done. The sky had spoken in the still air before sunrise. One could almost imagine what they felt, that faint, wordless grace of knowing the world was vast, ordered, and alive. They had read destiny among the stars. But what they also found was peace. And as the light returned, the heavens grew silent once more, waiting to be read again. Chapter 14. The keeper of incense and flame in every great city of Mesopotamia, from Ur to Babylon, from Nippur to Lagash, temples breathed, not with words, not with movement, but with smoke. It curled upward in the dawn light, slow and deliberate, rising through the still air like a thought making its way to heaven. This smoke was not decoration, nor a simple act of reverence. It was theology made visible to the people of ancient Mesopotamia. Fire and fragrance were languages. They were the unseen medium through which the human heart could reach the divine. Inside temple courtyards, a sacred fire burned without pause. Day and night, it glowed beneath stone altars, tended by hands that never forgot their duty. The keepers of this flame were priests, servants chosen not for their strength, but for their steadiness. Their title, in Sumerian, was Nuesh, the burner of incense. In Akkadian, Kepunurti, the keeper of flame. Their work was quiet, repetitive, and holy. At sunrise, they rekindled the embers. At dusk, they whispered invocations to guide the smoke heavenward. And in the still hours of night, they sat beside the glow, reciting hymns older than memory. Each breath of incense carried intention: cedar for cleansing, myrrh for offering, juniper for protection, frankincense for divine favor. As the resin sizzled and the smoke rose, it was believed that the gods inhaled its essence. The offering became communion, a bridge between mortal and divine realms. And for those who stood in the temple court, watching the tendrils rise, it was a reminder that their prayers did not vanish into silence, but ascended, transformed into something the gods could touch. The temple itself was designed around this exchange. At its heart stood the altar, open to the sky or crowned by a narrow vent above. The smoke, guided by architecture, traced an invisible path upward, as if the builders themselves had anticipated the direction of devotion. Each act of burning had rhythm. A hymn was sung to the god of the hour, to Shamash at dawn, to Sin at night, to Inanna at the rising of Venus. These hymns were memorized, never written during ritual. Their power was believed to flow through living voice, not inscription. The tone mattered as much as the words. Deep, slow, unwavering, a cadence meant to match the pace of breath, the pulse of life, the flicker of fire. One surviving text from Nippur describes a priest addressing the flame. Itself, O light that never sleeps, bearer of offering, tongue of the gods, speak for us where we cannot go. It was believed that fire had voice, though it spoke only to heaven. And so, the keeper's task was not only to feed the flame, but to listen. There was meaning in how it burned. A sudden flare, a soft hiss, a drifting of smoke toward the east. Each was read as a sign. The fire was not mere element. It was the messenger. This idea stretched far beyond Mesopotamia. Later, in Zoroastrian Persia, fire became a symbol of divine truth itself. But its earliest roots, the unbroken lineage of flame and fragrance, can be traced to these Sumerian courtyards, where devotion meant care, precision, and constancy. The fire was never to go out. To let it die was to let a thread between worlds snap. Each temple maintained strict rules. If the flame dimmed unexpectedly, the keeper had to purify himself, fast, and rekindle it with sacred wood. The act was not punishment, it was reconciliation. The gods, they believed, were patient but attentive. To tend the fire well was to live in balance. This constancy reflected a greater truth about Mesopotamian religion, that the divine was not only to be worshipped in moments of grandeur or crisis, but in the quiet maintenance of order. Keeping the flame alive mirrored the gods' own duty, sustaining creation against the encroachment of chaos. It is a subtle, beautiful thought, that every human act of care, no matter how small, echoed a cosmic act of preservation. The keeper's work was not dramatic. It required no visions, no miracles, only discipline, the kind that becomes devotion over time. And devotion, in their world, was the highest form of order. When we imagine ancient religion, we often picture spectacle, sacrifices, statues, grand processions. But much of sacred life in Mesopotamia was steady, rhythmic, almost meditative. The burning of incense was prayer through action. It taught patience. It taught presence. And it filled the air with a reminder that faith, like smoke, can only rise when fed from temple records. We know that the materials used were not local luxuries. Cedar came from Lebanon, myrrh and frankincense from Arabia, bitumen from the south. Each import was a small miracle of trade and dedication, proof that people across lands contributed to this unseen dialogue between earth and sky in some temples. A separate priest, the sang, recited hymns, while the keeper burned the offerings, their roles intertwined like breath and voice. The chants described the scent itself as divine. Language, let the cedar speak. Let the smoke write. Let the gods hear what we cannot say. Perhaps this was their understanding of spirituality, that faith does not always require words, that it can live in fragrance, in repetition, in the tending of a single quiet flame dot. In many ways, the keeper of incense was a poet of silence. Their art was invisible. The moment the smoke rose, it began to fade. And yet, its absence left something behind, a presence that lingered in air and memory alike. In that fading, they saw mystery. They believed the gods dwelled not only in light or thunder, but in what disappears gently where smoke faded. Silence carried its memory. This is how temples breathed, not with constant noise, but with alternating rhythm, flame, smoke, stillness. There is something deeply human in that pattern. It mirrors our own need for ritual, our own search for meaning in repetition. The keeper's work can seem distant now, but its essence is timeless, tending what connects us to what cannot be seen. Each of us, in some way, keeps a flame. It may be belief, or curiosity, or gratitude, but like that ancient fire, it asks for steady attention. It does not demand spectacle, only care, and when we pause long enough to notice the quiet, the way a scent lingers, the way a thought drifts upward and dissolves, we, too, take part in the oldest form of prayer. The Mesopotamian priests may not have known it in our words, but they understood it in theirs. That faith is not only something spoken, it is something tended, and so the keepers continued, century after century, generation after generation, as kings fell and temples crumbled, as new gods replaced old ones. Somewhere in the land between the rivers, a fire still burned, small, steady, breathing its smoke into the morning air, a bridge between the seen and the unseen. And perhaps, in the language of that rising smoke, the gods still listened. Chapter 15. Healers of body and soul in the ancient lands between the rivers, where temples mirrored the stars, and ziggurats rose, like ladders of clay, there walked two kinds of healers. One treated the body, the other, the soul. They were known as the Asu and the Ash. Together, they tended the fragile boundary between the human and the divine to the people of Mesopotamia. Sickness was never merely a physical affliction. It was a signal, a disturbance in the sacred order. Something had gone wrong between humankind and the gods. A promise broken, a word misused, a spirit offended. And so, to restore health, one had to restore harmony. The Asu was the physician in the earthly sense. He worked with what could be seen, touched, and mixed. Clay jars filled his table, powders, oils, resins, and herbs ground by hand. He boiled, bound, and measured with patience. His healing was born of observation, experiment, and inherited craft. The Asu was the hand of reason. The Asu Pru was the healer of the unseen. He spoke to the gods, to the demons, to the restless spirits thought to cause suffering. He memorized incantations from clay tablets, each syllable believed to carry power. His work was not simply to drive away disease, but to cleanse the invisible cause. The Ashapu was the voice of faith, and yet they were not rivals. They were two halves of one vision, that the body and soul could not be separated. Every wound of flesh had its echo in the spirit. Every ache of spirit left its mark on the flesh. When illness struck, the home became a sanctuary. The sick lay upon reed mats, anointed with oils of cedar, cypress, or juniper. At dawn, the Asu would arrive to examine the body, the pulse, the breath, the color of the skin. He might apply poultices of crushed plants, whispering soft words of reassurance. Then, when the practical remedies were set, the Ashapu would follow. He would sprinkle water drawn from a pure source, trace signs in the air, and speak the liptu, a ritual spell to drive away the invisible darkness to modern eyes. These rituals might seem like superstition, but to the Mesopotamian mind, this union of prayer and practice was perfect logic. The world was sacred, and so was every act within it. Healing was not just repair, it was reconciliation, a rejoining of what had drifted apart, human and divine, body and breath, matter and meaning. The tablets discovered in the ruins of Nineveh and Uruk reveal this partnership in remarkable detail. Some list complex recipes for salves, infusions, and surgical treatments written in the steady hand of the Asu. Others preserve chants and invocations against demons of disease, the voice of the Ash. Together, they form one of humanity's earliest medical systems, part science, part sacred art. For instance, the Diagnostic Handbook of the first millennium BCE offers symptoms and interpretations that read like an early medical manual. It begins by describing fevers, skin conditions, and mental disturbances, but soon shifts into divine reasoning. If the patient cannot speak, perhaps the hand of a ghost has touched his tongue. If the right side of the body weakens, perhaps a god of judgment has turned his gaze. Even diagnosis carried moral and spiritual weight. And so, when the Asu prepared his herbs, he was not simply treating symptoms. He was responding to the god's message, bringing balance where imbalance had been declared. The Ashapu, meanwhile, spoke a language that bridged visible and invisible realms. His rituals followed sacred patterns, washing, burning incense, and reciting precise sequences of words. Each word had power because it echoed creation itself. To speak was to shape reality. The same way the god Enki, master of wisdom and waters, spoke the world into form. The Ashapu spoke wellness back into being. He might hold a figurine of the afflicted person, a clay double, small and delicate. He would anoint it, pray over it, and cast it into flowing water. As the figure drifted away, so too was the sickness believed to depart. It was both symbol and therapy, a ritual of release. The dividing line between medicine and magic did not exist here. They were expressions of the same truth, that life was a sacred fabric, woven by seen and unseen hands alike. When the Asu crushed seeds of mustard or ground roots into a balm, his tools became instruments of divine will. When the Ashapu whispered incantations to the stars, his voice carried through the same cosmic order that governed the movements of the heavens. Each healer, in his own way, sought to restore me the divine order, the laws that sustained creation. These practices tell us something profound about how the ancient world understood care. The healer was not a distant figure. He was part of the household, bound by compassion and responsibility. The act of healing was itself a spiritual duty, not only to the patient, but to the gods who breathed life into every being. To heal someone was to reaffirm the sanctity of life. To ease their suffering was to honor the balance between heaven and earth in one tablet. A prayer to Gula, the goddess of healing, offers this quiet reflection. O Gula, great lady physician of the gods, may your hand bring life. May your heart bring mercy. Her temple dogs, seen in carvings and reliefs, were symbols of both loyalty and purification. Even the simplest gestures, cleansing a wound, lighting a lamp, saying a prayer, were seen as ways of aligning with her divine compassion. For the people who lived under the endless Mesopotamian sky, the gods were not distant rulers. They were present in every heartbeat, every drop of rain, every breath of incense that rose from a temple altar. To fall ill was to lose that rhythm. To heal was to find it again. In this sense, healing was never just about the end of pain. It was about returning to right relationship between self and world, between mortal and divine. The Asu worked through the hands. The Ashapu worked through the voice. Together they touched something eternal, the mystery that life, no matter how fragile, could be renewed. And perhaps that is why the ancient healers spoke so softly when tending to the sick, because they believed that in those quiet moments, as the incense burned and the chants faded into stillness, the gods might lean close enough to listen. Even now, across centuries of forgotten tongues and broken temples, their faith lingers in the dust of their tablets, in the traces of their words. The idea that care itself, compassion, attention, love is sacred, that to heal another is to momentarily bridge the distance between earth and heaven, and in that brief meeting of breath and silence, perhaps the gods touch mortal hands once more. Chapter 16. The Hidden Language of Seals. In the cradle of civilization, among riverbanks of clay and reeds, there existed a language without words. A language carved into stone, rolled across wet tablets, and pressed into eternity. It was the language of seals. Small, cylindrical carvings, no longer than a finger, yet holding entire worlds within their spiraled scenes. Each was a personal emblem, a sacred mark, and in many ways, a prayer made tangible in ancient Mesopotamia. When a priest, merchant, or king pressed a cylinder seal into soft clay, it was not simply an act of identification. It was a declaration before both men and gods. Each impression said, quietly, "Let this act be seen by heaven." Cylinder seals first appeared more than 5,000 years ago in the cities of Uruk, Ur, and Kish. At first glance, they might seem practical, even mundane. They were used to mark ownership, to authenticate documents, to seal containers of grain or jars of oil. But beneath this function lay something far more profound. For the Mesopotamians, writing itself was sacred. Every tablet was a living record, a surface upon which divine order was mirrored in human hands. To impress a seal upon such a tablet was not only to sign a name, it was to seal intention within the fabric of the world. The imagery carved into each seal was deliberate and symbolic. Lions and eagles, winged gods and kneeling supplicants, stars, trees, and rivers, all carried meaning understood by the initiated. They formed a silent theology, compressed into a cylinder of stone, when rolled out across wet clay. These images told a story of divine protection, of authority granted, of harmony between heaven and earth. Some seals bore the likeness of the owner, a priest with raised hands before a deity, perhaps, or a figure pouring libations before the sacred tree. Others showed myths condensed into a few graceful lines. The hero Gilgamesh wrestling the bull of heaven, or Enki releasing the waters of life. To wear such a seal was to carry a piece of the sacred narrative. The materials themselves held significance. Many were carved from lapis lazuli, carnelian, serpentine, or hematite, stones chosen for their luster and endurance. A seal's beauty was both aesthetic and metaphysical. It reflected the light of heaven, even as it impressed itself upon the earth. To create one required the skill of an artist-priest, a craftsman who understood that every groove and curve held power. The work was delicate, done with copper tools and patience. It was said that even the gods could recognize a man by the mark of his seal. In the great temples of Sumer and Akkad, priests used seals to sanctify contracts and offerings. When a gift was made to a god, perhaps a measure of grain or a carved idol, the seal marked it as sacred property. When two parties entered into agreement, the seal bore witness, ensuring that the transaction was not only legal, but divinely observed. Every sealed document became a covenant, a pact between souls, overseen by the celestial realm. To break a seal unjustly was not merely a crime. It was a sin against cosmic order. Thus, these small objects carried weight far beyond their size. They were both tools of bureaucracy and instruments of faith. Clay, once shaped by human hands, became a surface upon which heaven and earth met. The seal also spoke of identity. Before written signatures, before stamps or signets, a person's seal was their presence in absentia, their name without letters. To lose one was to lose a part of oneself. To gift one, a gesture of immense trust. Some were buried with their owners, placed on the chest or in the hand, as if to say, "May the gods recognize me by this mark when I stand before them, even in death." The seal was thought to speak on behalf of its keeper in this way. The cylinder seal became not just a practical tool, but an object of continuity, a link between life, death, and memory. It testified that every act, every promise, every prayer left an impression somewhere, seen or unseen. Archaeologists have uncovered tens of thousands of these seals, each one a microcosm of belief. When pressed into clay, they reveal an astonishing level of artistry, miniature narratives that flow seamlessly as the cylinder rolls. A worshipper approaches a seated deity. A winged figure raises a hand of blessing. Between them, a cuneiform inscription invokes divine favor in these simple images. The hierarchy of the universe is laid bare. Gods above, men below, yet bound in shared order. The seal was a reminder that even mundane acts, trade, law, communication, were sacred echoes of divine creation. Just as the gods impressed form upon chaos, so did man impress meaning upon clay. Some scholars believe that the seal was a physical metaphor for the cosmos itself. A cylinder, when rolled, leaves a continuous pattern, a repeating story, without beginning or end. To the Mesopotamian mind, this mirrored time as they knew it, cyclical, eternal, governed by divine rhythm. Each impression renewed that order. Each sealing reaffirmed the bond between mortal and immortal realms. But there was another layer, still, one not of authority or ritual, but of intimacy. When a seal was rolled, it required gentle pressure, steady and deliberate. It left behind the echo of touch, a trace of presence. And in that small act, the invisible was made visible. Imagine a scribe late at night, lamp flickering against wet clay. He rolls his seal across the tablet's surface, a quiet motion, precise and final. The pattern unfurls. A god, a star, a supplicant. He pauses. The impression gleams faintly in the light. And for a moment, the air feels heavier, almost sacred. because somewhere in that gesture lies the understanding that every human action, no matter how small, leaves a mark on clay, on memory. On the world over time, seals evolved. In later Babylonian and Assyrian periods, they became more complex, their motifs reflecting new pantheons and social orders. The old symbols of Enki and Inanna gave way to the storm god Adad, the sun god Shamash, and the winged emblem of Ashur. Yet the essence remained unchanged. To seal was still to consecrate, to align human intention with divine oversight. Even empires that conquered Mesopotamia adopted the practice. The Hittites, the Persians, and beyond all carried this silent inheritance. For in every civilization that followed, the act of sealing continued to represent faith in order, trust in word, and belief in witness unseen today. When we look upon those ancient seals in museum glass, they appear simple, even modest. Yet they whisper of a world where meaning was pressed into matter, where devotion could be rolled into clay and set to dry beneath the sun. A world where writing and worship were not separate acts, but the same sacred movement of hand and mind. The seal, in its smallness, tells a great truth, that to act with intention is to leave a trace upon creation, that every promise, spoken or carved, becomes part of the unseen archive of being. And perhaps, if one listens closely, each impression still carries the echo of that ancient invocation. Let this act be seen by heaven. Chapter 17. The House of the Dead in the lands between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Death was never seen as disappearance. It was a continuation, quiet, solemn, inevitable, a journey into the realm known simply as the land of no return. The Mesopotamians called it Kur or Erkala, the shadowed domain ruled by the goddess Ereshkigal, sister of Inanna. It was neither paradise nor punishment. It was the house of the dead. For thousands of years, the people of Mesopotamia carried a profound relationship with mortality. They did not deny it, nor did they celebrate it. Instead, they prepared for it through ritual remembrance and an intricate theology that saw death not as a punishment, but as part of divine order. In clay tablets, hymns, and laments, the priests preserved this understanding that to die was to enter a deeper stillness, one that required care from those left behind. The priests who tended to the dead were mediators between two worlds. Known by many titles, Gala priests, or lamentation singers, they guided families through the proper rites of passage. Their duties began at the moment of death. The body was washed, anointed with oil, and wrapped in linen. It was not only an act of cleanliness, but of sanctity. To cleanse the body was to prepare the soul for its descent. Burial took place close to home, beneath the floors of houses, or within nearby tombs, for the Mesopotamians believed that the dead should remain near the living. This proximity allowed continued communication through offerings, prayers, and remembrance. Every act of devotion, every small bowl of food or drop of water poured into the earth, nourished the soul on its quiet journey below. Death, to them, was not a rupture. It was a shift in presence from the seen to the unseen. In their myths, the underworld was described as dim and silent, a place where souls moved slowly, clothed in feathers, drinking from dusty streams. They lived in a version of the world above, but stripped of sunlight and joy. Even kings and heroes shared the same fate there, for in Mesopotamian belief, death was the great equalizer. The goddess Ereshkigal ruled this domain with dignity and inevitability. Her realm was not cruel, but it was final. When Inanna, goddess of life and fertility, once descended to visit her sister. She was stripped of her garments at each of the 7 gates, an allegory for the shedding of all worldly attachments. Only through her eventual resurrection did humanity glimpse the possibility of renewal. Yet, even then, death remained a cycle, not to be escaped, but to be respected. The priests understood this deeply. Their rituals for the dead were not designed to summon or control spirits, but to soothe them, to affirm that they were remembered. They performed laments, low, rhythmic chants that filled temples and courtyards with the sound of mourning. These chants were both music and medicine. Through tone and repetition, they bridged the sorrow of the living and the silence of the departed. On certain days, offerings were brought to family tombs: beer, bread, dates, and water, the staples of life. The living sat beside the graves, speaking softly to those they once loved. It was not mere sentiment, it was theology. The act of feeding the dead symbolized ongoing relationship, a recognition that bonds of affection persisted beyond the grave. The Mesopotamians believed that neglecting these rites could bring misfortune. A forgotten spirit might wander, hungry and restless, returning to disturb the living. Thus, remembrance was both love and duty. To care for the dead was to maintain balance between realms. It was said that those who honored their ancestors ensured blessings in their own lives, fertility of crops, harmony in homes, and protection from sickness. This cycle of offering and gratitude formed a rhythm as ancient as their rivers. Birth, death, and memory were intertwined, sustained by faith in a world both seen and unseen. The priesthood's role was to uphold this rhythm. Their rituals followed precise order, recitations from sacred texts, invocations to the gods of the underworld, and the lighting of incense to purify the threshold between life and death. In these ceremonies, every movement carried weight. The sound of the priest's voice echoed like a bridge between realities. The fragrance of incense rose as if to guide the departing soul upward before it turned to descend. Some texts, like the Descent of Ishtar and the Gilgamesh epic, described this passage as inevitable yet transformative. When Gilgamesh sought immortality, he learned that eternity belonged not to man, but to the divine. The wisdom he gained that to be human is to live fully within limits became a cornerstone of Mesopotamian thought. Death, in this way, was not defeat. It was completion in temples dedicated to Nergal and Ereshkigal. Priests offered prayers for protection from the forces of decay and disease, for these too were seen as manifestations of imbalance between realms. When plague struck or illness spread through a city, rituals were performed to appease the underworld gods, asking that they accept offerings instead of lives. Even healing and death were intertwined, for one could not be understood without the other. The priests recited hymns that spoke of the Kisbu, the monthly ritual feast for ancestors. Families gathered at the tomb, pouring libations and whispering names. Names held power. To speak them was to keep a soul alive within memory's light. To forget them was to let that light fade. In this way, remembrance became sacred labor. It gave shape to grief and meaning to mortality. Every act of memory reaffirmed the unity between the living and the dead. Imagine an evening in your thousands of years ago. The air is still and warm. A small oil lamp flickers beside a clay tomb. A woman kneels, holding a bowl of water. She pours it slowly onto the ground, murmuring her father's name. Nearby, a priest hums a soft lament, his voice steady and low. The city hums faintly in the distance. Yet, in this quiet act, something timeless endures. The boundary between worlds thins, just for a moment. Archaeologists have uncovered these traces: burial pits beneath homes, small jars containing offerings, tablets inscribed with prayers to the ancestors. Even ordinary families took part. The priesthood simply ensured that the rituals were done correctly, preserving the sacred balance between worlds. What these findings reveal is not superstition, but care. The Mesopotamians saw the universe as interconnected: heaven above, earth in the middle, and the underworld below, each sustained by respect. To neglect one was to unbalance all. Thus, the house of the dead was not a place of fear. It was a mirror of life's order, solemn, patient, enduring. A realm where the soul rested, and the memory of it sustained the living. In later Babylonian and Assyrian traditions, this belief continued. Texts from the first millennium BCE describe offerings to the Atimu, the spirit of the deceased. Even as empires rose and fell, the idea remained unchanged, that life flowed in cycles, and that remembrance was a form of worship. Over time, this quiet theology would echo far beyond Mesopotamia. The Greeks, Egyptians, and Hebrews all inherited traces of it: the sense that the dead require care, and that mourning, when done with reverence, sanctifies both worlds. To modern eyes, the Mesopotamian underworld may seem bleak, a land without sunlight, where even heroes drink from muddy pools. Yet within their understanding lies something deeply human. They knew that life and death were not opposites, but phases of one continuous breath in their cities of clay. Among ziggurats and temples, the priests kept that breath steady. Through lament, offering, and prayer, they ensured that death remained part of the living world, neither forgotten nor feared. And perhaps that was their greatest wisdom. That peace was not found in denying death, but in remembering, in speaking the names, in tending the fires, in pouring the water. For where remembrance endures, the dead are never truly gone. They rest, quietly, in the house below, and in the hearts of those who still whisper their names. Chapter 18: Divination and the Art of Signs in the Ancient Cities of Mesopotamia. Wisdom was not always written in words. It drifted through smoke, shimmered in oil, and split through bone and clay. The divine world was believed to be constantly speaking through patterns, movements, and coincidences. The question was never if the gods spoke. It was whether one had learned how to listen. For the Mesopotamians, divination was not superstition, it was a form of literacy, a way to read the structure of reality itself. The priests who practiced it were not magicians or fortune-tellers. They were interpreters of cosmic order. To them, the world was a vast script, written by unseen hands. Every event, every flicker of flame or flight of a bird, was a word in that endless text. These priests belonged to an ancient scholarly class known as the Baru, often translated as diviners. They served in temples and royal courts, acting as advisors to kings and interpreters of fate. In their worldview, the gods sent messages, continually warnings, approvals, omens woven into the natural and the accidental. To read these messages was not an act of curiosity, but of responsibility. For in a world governed by divine will, ignorance was dangerous. A king who ignored a sign risked losing not only his crown but his life. The Baru's craft was meticulous. They studied the heavens, the weather, the movement of flocks, the cracks in sacrificial livers. Each observation was recorded with patient care on clay tablets. Over centuries, These tablets became libraries of divine communication, manuals of how the universe had spoken before. From these archives, the priests learned patterns, correspondences, and the subtle grammar of the unseen. Among the oldest and most sacred of their arts was ecstasy divination through the inspection of animal organs. When an offering was made, the liver of the sacrificed animal was studied for marks, textures, and shapes. A protrusion here, a darkened patch there each, was thought to indicate a divine message. The liver, they believed, mirrored the structure of the cosmos. By reading it, the priest glimpsed the disposition of the gods. If the omens were favorable, the path ahead was clear. If not, rituals would be performed to avert disaster before it could unfold. In time, they created intricate liver models, clay replicas, divided into sections, each inscribed with interpretations. These models were used to train apprentices, to preserve the language of signs across generations. To the modern eye, these may seem like curiosities of a primitive age. Yet, in truth, they reveal a profound understanding of the relationship between observation and meaning. The Mesopotamian diviner did not invent signs, he discovered them, as though the world itself were an oracle. Another common practice was laconomancy, the reading of oil poured upon water. The priests would fill a bowl, recite invocations, and pour drops of oil upon the surface. They would watch how the oil spread, separated, or formed shapes, interpreting each as a divine message. The ripples became sentences, the reflections, and in this gentle act of watching, they practiced a form of meditative attention that few modern minds would recognize. It was not about prediction alone, it was about presence. To observe was to commune. To wait for meaning to emerge was, itself, an act of reverence. Beyond the temple, signs filled daily life. The flight of a bird across the sky could determine whether a journey should begin. The pattern of a dream might reveal the favor or displeasure of a deity. In dream divination, the sleeping mind was seen as a sacred gateway, a neutral space where divine and human could meet. Temples had designated dream interpreters who recorded dreams and cross-referenced them with known omens. One dream might mean victory in battle, another a coming flood. Even the sound of a thunderclap or the way a door creaked could hold significance. This might seem, to us, like a world burdened by constant vigilance, a place where every small event demanded interpretation. But to them, it was the opposite. It was reassurance that nothing was random, that existence was threaded with meaning, that even silence had a pattern, if only one listened deeply enough. Divination, in its essence, was not the prediction of the future. It was the reading of relationship between heaven and earth, between human intent and divine will, between cause and consequence. Every omen was a reflection of balance or imbalance between these forces. When a ruler sought an omen before war, he was not merely asking, "Will I win?" He was asking whether the gods approved of his cause. If they did not, the priest would counsel restraint, repentance, or ritual cleansing. Thus, the art of divination served as a moral compass, not just a strategic one. It tied governance to humility, action to awareness. In a way, it was the earliest form of dialogue between man and the unseen. A dialogue that required silence, attention, and patience, qualities easily lost in the noise of ambition. Perhaps this is why the Baru was so respected, not because they controlled fate, but because they waited for it to speak. Even the great libraries of Nineveh and Babylon preserved thousands of omen texts. Among them were collections like the Enuma, Anu-Enlil, monumental record of celestial omens. It contained over 70 tablets cataloging every possible configuration of the heavens and what each meant for kings and kingdoms. If the moon was red, if Venus appeared late, if an eclipse occurred on the wrong Dayach sign had meaning. Through the stars, the priests believed they were reading the pulse of creation itself. There was no strict line between religion and science here. The study of the skies for omens led directly to the birth of astronomy. By watching patterns of light for divine meaning, they also began to measure, predict, and record with mathematical precision. The divine became the doorway to the empirical, and perhaps, in a way, the empirical never lost its sacred roots at its heart. Mesopotamian divination taught a simple lesson. The universe speaks in patterns, and understanding comes through patience. In reading omens, they were not forcing answers, they were waiting for the world to unfold its rhythm. It was not about certainty, but alignment. Not about knowing the future, but moving in harmony with it. Today, the ancient clay tablets rest silent in museum cases. Their wedge-shaped inscriptions tell of kings long gone, of floods and victories and stars that no longer shine the same way. Yet the impulse they record, the longing to find meaning in the unpredictable, remains deeply human. Even now, we glance at coincidences, recurring numbers, or chance encounters, and wonder if they, too, are signs. Perhaps the only difference is that we no longer know the language. The Mesopotamian priests believed that to live without signs was to live without conversation. And perhaps that is what we have lost, the art of listening to the quiet patterns beneath our days. In the end, their wisdom may still whisper to us. Every shadow is a word, every wind a message, but you must first learn to wait long enough to hear it. Chapter 19. The Library of Ashurbanipal in the heart of ancient Nineveh. Beneath the shadow of Assyria's great palaces, there once stood a sanctuary not of gods, but of knowledge. It was not built from marble or gold, but from clay, simple, fragile clay. Yet from that clay rose one of the most extraordinary achievements in human history, the Library of Ashurbanipal, the world's first great repository of written wisdom. Here, words became a kind of immortality. Every tablet, a heartbeat of the civilization that shaped the ancient Near East. Every inscription, a whisper from the minds of priests, kings, and scribes who sought to preserve what the flood of time so easily washed away. The king who ordered its creation in the 7th century BCE was no ordinary ruler. He was a warrior, yes, but also a scholar, a man who could read Sumerian, Akkadian, and the complex cuneiform script that had endured for millennia. He saw knowledge as both power and protection. In a world ruled by omens and divine will, he believed that wisdom itself could be a form of prayer. So he gathered it, preserved it, and built a sanctuary where even the gods might pause to listen. Within the library's walls were tens of thousands of clay. Tablets, some sources suggest over 30,000, arranged by subject and catalogued with careful precision. The scribes who served here were not mere record keepers. They were custodians of sacred memory. They copied texts on medicine, astronomy, mathematics, law, and mythology. They preserved the incantations of priests, the dreams of kings, and the instructions of gods. To them, writing was not an invention. It was a covenant in Mesopotamian thought. Words held a kind of spiritual gravity. To inscribe a word into clay was to bind an idea to the physical world, to make it eternal. The scribes worked in silence, pressing wedge-shaped symbols into soft tablets with reed styluses. drying them carefully in the sun or baking them in ovens. Each tablet carried both human thought and divine approval. To write was to participate in creation, to preserve, to resist oblivion. Among the most remarkable works found in Ashurbanipal's library was the Epic of Gilgamesh's story, already ancient in his time. Its tablets told of kings and gods, of the Great Flood, and of one man's search for immortality. It is one of the oldest surviving pieces of literature known to humankind, and it might have vanished forever if not for this library. When modern archaeologists unearthed it from the sands of Nineveh in the 19th century, they uncovered not only a story, but a voice echoing from nearly 3,000 years ago. But the library was far more than a collection of myths. It was a reflection of how deeply intertwined the sacred and the scientific were in Mesopotamian life. The same shelves that held hymns to the gods also contained medical treatises and records of celestial events. There was no separation between faith and inquiry, between the priest and the scientist. Both sought to understand the structure of the universe, to decode its laws, whether divine or natural. One section of the library was dedicated entirely to magic and exorcism texts known as the series of the Uruk Lemnatu. These writings described how to combat evil spirits and restore harmony between the human and the divine. They contained prayers, rituals, and instructions for the Ashapu, the priestly healer. Through these texts, the priests learned to bridge the visible and the unseen. Every formula, every chant, was both a cure and a confession of faith in the invisible order of things. Another section dealt with astronomy and omens, detailed records of the movements of stars, planets, and eclipses. The scribes believed that by reading the heavens, they could glimpse the intentions of the gods. These records were not mere superstition. They were careful observations, compiled over centuries. They mark the earliest roots of empirical thought science. Born from reverence, the library also held collections of law and administration, copied from earlier Sumerian and Babylonian sources. These tablets outlined social duties, contracts, and punishments, reflecting a civilization built on both justice and hierarchy. Yet even here, the divine was never far away. Law was not only civic, it was cosmic. To violate it was not merely to offend one's neighbor, but to disrupt the balance between heaven and earth. Ashurbanipal's vision for this library was both practical and spiritual. He ordered scribes from across his empire to copy older texts from Babylon, Uruk, and Nippur, ensuring that no wisdom would be lost. Clay was fragile, but memory was resilient. And through this act of gathering, he became more than a king. He became a guardian of civilization's collective soul. There is something profoundly human about this desire to preserve, to capture the ephemeral, to protect what time would otherwise erase. The clay tablets were not just records of power, they were prayers against forgetting. Each one whispered the same plea: let this knowledge survive. When Nineveh fell to invading armies in 612 BCE, flames consumed the palace and city alike. Yet, in an unexpected twist of fate, the library's destruction became its salvation. The fires that tore through the palace baked many of the clay tablets hard, turning them from soft earth into durable ceramic. In their ruin, they became eternal. What was meant to be erased was instead preserved, buried beneath layers of ash, waiting to be rediscovered. Centuries passed, empires rose and vanished. And then, in the 19th century, archaeologists uncovered the lost city. When they brushed away the dust from those tablets, they found that the voices of the ancient scribes still spoke clearly. Their symbols, their stories, their equations all intact. It was as if the library had been sleeping, waiting for someone to listen again. Even today, many of its tablets remain untranslated. They rest quietly in museums, holding secrets of medicine, ritual, and history yet to be understood. Each one still carries the touch of the scribe who pressed it, perhaps whispering a prayer as he did. In this way, the library of Ashurbanipal continues its work, not as a relic of the past, but as a living reminder that knowledge, once born, resists death. And in reflecting on that, one might wonder, what is it that we choose to preserve today? What fragments of our world will survive the centuries to come? Will our words etched not in clay but in light endure, as theirs did? Or will the silence that once swallowed Nineveh return again, waiting to be broken by another future hand? The priests of old believed that to remember was an act of faith, that to preserve was to honor both the gods and the fragile beauty of the human mind. And so they wrote patiently, reverently trusting that even after their world fell silent, their words would still speak. And they were right. Through those fragile tablets, they still do. Chapter 20. The decline of the temples. There was a time when the temple was the world's center. It was not simply a place of worship, but the heart of the cosmos, a bridge between the seen and the unseen. Every stone, every chant, every procession mirrored a deeper harmony believed to bind heaven and earth. But with the passing of centuries, that harmony began to shift, as power moved from the hands of priests to the thrones of kings. The sacred lost its supremacy. What had once been divine order slowly turned into earthly rule. In the great cities of the Near East, in Sumer, Egypt, Babylon, and beyond, temples once controlled the rhythm of life. Their priests dictated planting seasons, judged disputes, oversaw medicine, astronomy, and ritual. They were keepers of law, of time, of truth. To enter the temple was to step into the structure of creation itself, yet history rarely remained still. Over time, the temple's language began to change. The offerings that had once been fruits of devotion became measures of tribute. The hands that once cleansed altars began to count coins. The power that once called rain from heaven now called armies to march. It began slowly, a taxation here, a decree there. Kings realized that the blessings of the gods could be spoken through them instead of through the priesthood. They wore crowns that shimmered like halos, built palaces beside the sanctuaries, and carved their victories into temple walls. The divine became political by the first millennium BC. Across much of the ancient world, the old cosmic order had fractured. In Mesopotamia, the temples of Enlil and Ishtar still stood, but their influence waned as royal administrations took charge of wealth and land. In Egypt, the priesthood of Ammon that had once guided pharaohs began to be absorbed, replaced, or silenced by the state. Even in Greece, where the oracle once shaped the fate of empires, philosophers began to speak of reason over ritual, of ethics over offerings. It was not an abrupt fall, but a long erosion, a quiet fading of sacred authority beneath the weight of empire and economy. As trade routes expanded, so did new hierarchies. Merchants, once pilgrims, became patrons. Wealth replaced initiation as the gateway to influence. Where temples once stored wisdom in stone and scripture, markets began to store value in metal and grain. The sacred calendar, once dictating the flow of life, began to lose its rhythm. Festivals became spectacles. Offerings became taxes. The divine became distant, still worshipped, but no longer consulted in the same way. And yet, even as the outer life of the temple declined. Its geometry endured, beneath ruins of mud brick and limestone. The same alignments that once marked the solstice still traced the path of the sun. Even the cities that rose on top of them unknowingly echoed their orientation, as if some deeper memory refused to vanish. There's an irony here. The same kings who sought to silence the temples often built their palaces upon them. The same merchants who dismissed the rituals still used the temple's sacred courtyards as their marketplaces. And the same scholars who questioned the gods still studied beneath the stars. Once charted by temple astronomers, the sacred had been diminished, but not destroyed. It had retreated into the foundations, the geometry, the silence in Babylon. As the empire expanded under Nebuchadnezzar, the ziggurats remained standing, but their rituals shifted. The offerings that once rose in smoke to heaven became political symbols, gestures of loyalty. The priests who once read omens from the heavens were now reading the decrees of kings. In Greece, the old sanctuaries began to empty. Delphi's oracle, once the voice of Apollo, fell silent as Rome's legions marched east. By the time of the early Christian era, many of the old temples were abandoned, their columns repurposed, their stones carried away to build basilicas and fortresses. Yet still, deep beneath layers of civilization, fragments of those temples linger. Their blueprints shaped cities long after their names were forgotten. Their symbols reappeared in later faiths: the sacred lamp, the serpent of healing, the winged disc. It's as if the memory of the temple became part of human instinct. When people built cathedrals, mosques, or monasteries, they unknowingly revived the same proportions, the same longing for vertical connection. The geometry remained because it was never truly architectural, it was psychological. It expressed something inward, the desire to ascend, to align, to listen. So even as the priesthood lost its cosmic voice, its essence persisted in silence. The chants faded, but the frequencies they had awakened seemed to echo in later music, in sacred architecture, in the cadence of prayer. And perhaps that is how sacred knowledge survives, not in the words themselves, but in the patterns they leave behind. When the Assyrian temples of Ashur fell to ruin, when Egypt's sanctuaries of Ammon crumbled beneath desert wind, and when Delphi's oracle was replaced by imperial decree, the sacred did not die. It withdrew. It hid in manuscripts, in monasteries, in memory. Sometimes it hid in plain sight, in symbols engraved into thresholds, in rituals disguised as folklore. In every civilization that followed, pieces of the old temple rose again, changed in form, but constant in meaning. In the chant of monks, in the silence of cloisters, in the light falling through stained glass, one can still sense the same attempt to hold the world together through harmony, because the temple was never merely a building. It was a philosophy of balance between heaven and earth, between order and chaos, between time and eternity. And when that philosophy was replaced by conquest and commerce, something subtle but immense was lost. Society became louder, faster, more outwardly powerful, but less attuned to the inner. Kings ruled, markets thrived, empires expanded, but the quiet conversation between the human soul and the infinite grew faint. Still, deep within ruins and scriptures, the old proportions remain. Archaeologists measure them, historians describe them, but perhaps their true meaning cannot be reconstructed, only remembered. The decline of the temples was not only the end of a religious order, it was the end of a worldview, one that saw every stone, every gesture, every breath as part of a living cosmos. And yet, what is forgotten often waits to be found again. Some say the modern world is rediscovering that geometry through meditation, through sacred architecture, through the quiet search for meaning beyond material success. The pattern has resurfaced, not as doctrine, but as intuition. The same yearning for harmony that once built ziggurats and sanctuaries now builds inner altars, spaces of silence and remembrance. Perhaps decline was never destruction, but transformation. Perhaps the temples had to fall, so that their essence could scatter to live within hearts instead of stone. And so, across ages and empires, what began as the fall of the sacred may yet be its quiet return. The stones are gone, the songs are dust, but somewhere beneath the noise of modernity, the old geometry still breathes, waiting for those who can hear its rhythm once more. Chapter 21 echoes in the Bible and beyond when the first Hebrew scribes began to write. The clay libraries of Mesopotamia had already stood for 1,000 years. By then, the stories of gods and creation, of floods and divine law, had been etched into tablets, preserved by the hands of priests who saw knowledge as sacred inheritance. These were the same stories that would one day find new life in the Bible, but long before they became scripture. They were hymns sung to forgotten gods in temples that no longer stand, across centuries of transmission, exile, and translation. Something remarkable happened. Ancient Mesopotamian theology, its rhythms, its symbols, its understanding of the divine began to flow quietly into the veins of later religions. And so, the memory of those first priestly civilizations did not die. It transformed in the city of Nippur, long before the rise of Israel. Priests spoke of a paradise where gods and humans once walked together, a sacred garden watered by 4 rivers. In Sumerian, it was called Dilmun, a land pure, bright, and eternal. There, no sickness or death was known, and all beings lived in harmony. When the book of Genesis was composed many centuries later, its writers described a similar garden, Eden, divided by 4 rivers, untouched by death, and watched over by divine presence. The echo is unmistakable. Different language, different faith, but the same spiritual geography. The story of Adam and Eve's exile is, in essence, the story of humanity's separation from the divine order, a theme that already shaped Sumerian myths. In the poem of Enki and Ninhursag, disobedience in paradise leads to the loss of immortality. The pattern is older than the text we know, yet carried forward like a seed. Even the serpent, the one who tempts, who speaks wisdom and brings downfall, existed long before Genesis. In Mesopotamian iconography, serpents were sacred to the god Ningishida, lord of rebirth, a symbol of both wisdom and danger. So when later texts used the serpent as a figure of duality, of knowledge that frees but also divides, they were drawing upon a language of symbols humanity already understood. The same continuity can be heard in the flood story, one of the most enduring myths on earth. Long before Noah, there was Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Sumerian flood. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, he tells of how the gods, angered by humanity's noise and pride, decided to drown the world. Only one man was warned, a righteous one, and instructed to build a great boat. He gathered animals, his family, and the seed of all living things. When the waters receded, his ark rested upon a mountain. He released a dove, a swallow, and finally a raven to test if the land was dry. Thousands of years later, in the Hebrew scriptures, Noah's flood would repeat the same gestures, nearly word for word. A different God, a new covenant. Yet the same archetype, the same rhythm of destruction and renewal. It suggests not imitation, but inheritance. As the people of Israel lived in exile in Babylon, surrounded by the ruins of the very temples where these older myths were kept, their own sacred stories began to absorb the language of the land. The result was not plagiarism, but transformation, a recentering of the cosmic story around one transcendent God instead of many. Where the Sumerians saw a pantheon of competing deities, the Hebrews envisioned unity. Where the Babylonians told of gods who regretted their creation, the Bible spoke of a creator who grieved yet loved what he made. The form remained, but the spirit evolved. Even the idea of divine law, of commandments written in stone, finds ancient echoes in Babylon. Hammurabi's code stood as one of the first written sets of laws. Engraved upon basalt around 1750 BCE, above the carved text sits the image of Hammurabi receiving the laws from Shamash, the sun god and judge of the universe. A divine being granting wisdom to a chosen lawgiver, an image mirrored centuries later when Moses ascends Sinai to receive the 10 Commandments. The parallels extend beyond symbolism. Hammurabi's code governed justice, property, and ethics, not unlike the Mosaic laws that would later shape Israelite society. But again, the difference lies in theology. In Mesopotamia, justice was part of maintaining order among gods and men. In the Hebrew vision, justice became moral, rooted in a single divine will, not the balance of rival deities. Through this transformation, the old structure of priestly order, once measured in offerings and omens, became a moral order written on the human heart. Even the first chapter of Genesis, the creation story, bears traces of older hymns. In the Babylonian Enuma Elish, the universe begins in chaos, with the mingling of primeval waters, Apsu and Tiamat. From their conflict, the world is born. The god Marduk slays Tiamat, divides her body, and creates heaven and earth. Genesis begins with a quieter echo. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. In Hebrew, the deep Tem sounds remarkably like Tiamat, but here there is no violent battle. Instead, creation unfolds through divine speech. Let there be light. Order emerges not from war, but from word. It is a reimagining of the same cosmic pattern, chaos into order, darkness into light, retold through a gentler theology. And this shift from conflict to commandment marks the turning point of spiritual history. Scholars sometimes describe this as mythic continuity. It is not that one culture copied another, but that each generation translated the sacred into its own understanding. The temple priests of Mesopotamia recorded their wisdom in clay. The prophets of Israel recast it in scrolls. Later, Greek and Roman thinkers would interpret those same truths through philosophy, and eventually, Christianity and Islam would inherit them again, reshaping the ancient cosmology into new spiritual frameworks. The very idea of divine creation, moral law, and sacred covenant ideas that now define Western thought trace their roots to those early river valleys. The priestly worldview of Mesopotamia saw the universe as a vast temple. The heavens were its roof, the earth its floor, and humanity its caretaker. When later scriptures spoke of creation as good, they were echoing that same reverence, that same belief that to live rightly was to maintain harmony within the divine design. Even in modern religions, that architecture persists. The notion of sacred time, of Sabbaths and holy days, mirrors the old temple calendar, where the rhythm of ritual followed the stars. The concept of divine judgment, the weighing of deeds, the recording of names can be traced to the Mesopotamian Book of Life, where gods inscribe the fates of mortals each new year. The continuity is profound, yet subtle. It reminds us that humanity's earliest search for meaning never truly ended. It only changed its form in the end. What we call the Bible, the Quran, or any sacred text is part of a much older conversation, a dialogue between the human and the divine that began in clay and continued in ink. Every line, every law, every prayer carries the imprint of civilizations that once looked up at the same stars and asked the same questions. Why are we here? What is good? And who or what listens when we pray? The ancient priests who shaped those first myths may not have imagined how far their words would travel, yet through their vision of creation, covenant, and the divine order, the foundation for all later spirituality was laid. The temples may have fallen, but their theology became immortal, embedded in the scriptures that would define humanity's conscience for millennia, even today. When one reads, "In the beginning," the echo of older beginnings stirs beneath the words. The clay tablets whisper beneath the parchment. The forgotten hymns hum beneath the psalms. And perhaps that is the true miracle, not the survival of a single faith, but the endurance of a shared human longing, a memory of order, a hope for meaning, a voice that still speaks across time, from clay to scripture to soul. Chapter 22. When the gods fell silent, there comes a point in every civilization when the gods stop answering. Not because they are gone, but because the world has changed its way of listening. In Mesopotamia, the temples once glowed with firelight. Scribes murmured prayers over tablets of clay. Priests read the stars, the smoke, the entrails of sacrifice, listening for messages written in the fabric of reality itself. For thousands of years, this was the center of human life, the dialogue between the mortal and the divine. But then, the voices began to fade. As new empires rose, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, the old sanctuaries began to empty. Statues of gods were carried away as trophies. The fires that once burned in honor of Enlil and Inanna grew cold, and the sacred cities, built to align with the heavens, fell into quiet dust. It is easy to call it an ending, but perhaps it was something else, a transition. A long exhale after ages of devotion, when the last priests of Uruk and Babylon performed their rites. They did so knowing the world was turning. Their chants echoed across hollow courtyards. Their offerings, once meant to sustain the gods, now fed only memory. For centuries, the divine had been bound to stone, to ziggurats, altars, and sacred texts. But as power shifted to kings, and later to empires built on trade and law, the gods withdrew into silence. Some believed they had abandoned the earth. Others whispered that they had simply gone inward, retreating from the outer world into the human soul. And maybe that is where they remain. In ancient hymns, silence was not absence. It was reverence, the stillness before creation, the pause between breaths of divine speech. To the Sumerians, the beginning of the cosmos was not sound but silence. The gods emerged from the quiet waters of the deep, from Apsu and Tiamat, from the unspoken potential that precedes existence itself. When the temples fell, that same silence returned. It was not the death of faith, but the restoration of its original form, the quiet knowing that sacredness does not depend on buildings or rituals, but on awareness. The priests once read omens in the smoke. Now, silence itself became the omen. They had spent millennia trying to listen to the gods, but perhaps the final revelation was this: the divine had always been listening to them. When archaeologists uncovered the ruins of Nineveh and Uruk, they found thousands of tablets buried in dust, the voices of priests, kings, and poets, all speaking to vanished gods. At first glance, these seemed like relics of superstition, but to read them slowly is to hear something deeper: the first human struggle to understand meaning, justice, and mortality. They were not only writing to the gods, they were writing to time. They knew their cities would one day crumble, and so they left words, invocations, hymns, prayers, as messages for whoever might one day listen again. In that sense, their silence was never complete. Their voices continue, pressed into clay, still legible after 4,000 years. The gods fell silent, but the human spirit did not. Silence itself became a form of devotion. When sound and ceremony vanished, contemplation began. Where once there had been ritual, there was now reflection. Where once there had been fire and incense, there was the long breath of thought. Philosophers in Greece and sages in Persia began to speak of a hidden order, not many gods, but one truth beneath all. Mystics in Babylon and prophets in Judea began to describe revelation not as thunder, but as a still small voice. And from this quiet, the great spiritual traditions of the later world were born. The silence of the gods did not end faith. It transformed it. There is a kind of peace in knowing that silence itself is sacred. For the Mesopotamians, every temple represented the cosmos in miniature, a meeting place between heaven and earth. When the temples vanished, that meeting place had to move, and so it moved inward into the human heart. Perhaps this was the gods' final act, to step back and allow humanity to find divinity within, to let their statues crumble so that their essence could dissolve into consciousness itself. The stars that priests once charted to find divine will still shine above us, but now the interpretations belong to us. Each gaze a continuation of that same ancient wonder in the ruins of Babylon. Archaeologists once found an inscription carved in Akkadian: "May the wise remember. May the foolish learn." It was not a warning, nor a boast. It was an offering to time, a hope that memory itself could preserve what stone could not. And indeed, memory has. The myths of creation, the laws of Hammurabi, the prayers to Ishtar and Marduk all continue to echo in our languages, our scriptures, and our art. The divine has changed names countless times, but the impulse behind it, to reach beyond oneself, to make sense of suffering, to honor life, has not. Even the very word spirit comes from breath. To breathe is to live. To live consciously is to listen. And in that listening, something of the old gods still stirs. If you walk through the ruins of your today, the wind carries through the broken gates like a soft chant. No priests remain to interpret it. No incense burns. Yet the rhythm of that wind feels almost familiar, like a voice speaking through time, not to demand worship, but to remind us that sacredness is not bound to any age. The silence that followed the gods was not a void. It was continuity, a new form of reverence taking shape. The fires may have dimmed, but the warmth remains, invisible yet enduring. For every time humanity forgets, it also remembers. Every temple that falls becomes soil for new faiths to rise. And every silence eventually teaches us to listen again. When the gods fell silent, humanity did not lose them. We inherited them. Their myths became our metaphors. Their temples became our languages. Their prayers became our longing. And though their names have faded, their peace, that quiet breath between earth and eternity, still lingers in us. Perhaps that was the message all along, that the sacred never truly fades. It only changes form, waiting for us to listen once more.